Test, test, test. Excuse me, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started in a couple minutes. If everybody could take their seats.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for being here today. I know how busy everyone in this room is, as members of Congress, as staff members who normally like to wave to their boss on their flyout day and catch up on everything, scholars, athletes, and administrators. You have no shortage of demands on your time. And the fact that you chose to spend part of your day here with us tells me something important. It tells me that you care deeply about the future of college sports and that you believe this moment deserves serious, careful attention. And that's exactly why we're here. The purpose of today's Congressional College Athletics Summit is simple. It's to reset the conversation on college sports. We wanted to bring together a diverse array of leaders from across the college sports ecosystem to have an honest conversation about where we're headed and where we should go next. It's not a press conference. It's not a hearing designed to score points. It's a real discussion that reflects the complexity of the moment that we're in. And when you look at the program we've assembled today, it's hard not to be encouraged. I mean, we have panelists representing labor and industry, experts from academia and antitrust law, leaders who have spent their careers fighting for Title IX and Olympic sports, athletes, current and former, who we know can speak the best about what's happening on the court and on the field. Leaders who understand the realities facing Power Four programs and champions who understand what it means to keep the lights on at smaller schools, at HBCUs, and at institutions that are too often left out of the conversation. I guarantee we will hear disagreement from some of our panelists. That is a feature, not a bug, of today's summit. And I'm deeply grateful to every panelist who agreed to be here, and not just for lending us their expertise, but for their willingness to engage in good faith. I'm equally grateful to all of you in the audience and on the live stream who are part of this important discussion. Because here's the truth. Despite what some have been saying currently, recently, lately, I truly believe that the system of college sports is better today than it was a decade ago. I believe that not just as a member of Congress, but as a former Division I player myself, Is the system perfect? No, absolutely not. And are there challenges and growing pains ahead? Absolutely. But it's undeniable that athletes today have more rights, more freedom, and more of a voice than they've ever had before. They have greater control of their NIL. They have new opportunities to advocate for their health, their safety, and their education. They're being recognized finally as stakeholders rather than just a means for a multi-billion-dollar industry built on their hard work. And that did not happen by accident. It happened because athletes spoke up. It happened because the courts enforced the law, because advocates pushed for change, and because Congress, at times, chose not to stand in the way of progress. What athletes have done is an achievement worth celebrating. It's not a mistake that needs to be corrected. Unfortunately, much of the conversation about the future of college sports over this past year has taken a very different tone. Too often it's been focused on restricting athletes' rights, silencing their voices, and attempting to return to a system that overwhelmingly benefited a small group of traditional power brokers at the expense of the athletes themselves, at the expense of women's sports, at the expense of Olympic sports, at the expense of smaller schools, HBCUs, non-revenue programs that already operate on the margins. That approach was embodied most clearly in the advancement and twice failed consideration of the SCORE Act. From the very beginning, the SCORE Act was deeply flawed. It was developed behind closed doors. It was partisan in both its drafting and its advancement. Key stakeholders, especially athletes themselves, were sidelined or shut out entirely. And when concerns were raised, they were too often dismissed rather than addressed and negotiated. On policy, the bill was just wrong. The SCORE Act places heavy restrictions on athletes' NIL rights, codifying the most anti-competitive parts of the House settlement. It entrenched the power of the NCAA and the Power II conferences by granting them sweeping exemptions from antitrust law, cementing their roles as judge, jury, and executioner in college sports in perpetuity. Women's sports, Olympic sports, and smaller schools are being told, in essence, to trust that the benefits will eventually trickle down. And HBCUs and less resourced programs are left scrounging for table scraps in a system designed to lock in existing hierarchies. That's not reform. That's return to the status quo, and it cannot, nor should it be considered the only option before us. I believe that there's a better path forward, one that can and should be bipartisan, one that centers athletes while balancing the interests of conference commissioners and college presidents. That belief is what led me to introduce the College Athletics Reform Act. At its core, my legislation starts from a simple premise. College athletics exist because of the athletes. Any sustainable future for this ecosystem must recognize athletes as full participants with enforceable rights, not as an afterthought. The College Athletics Reform Act accomplishes this in several ways. First, it protects athletes' NIL rights rather than restricting them, setting a strong federal floor. It ensures that athletes can continue to benefit from the value they create without being subjected to arbitrary caps, conference-driven controls, or opaque enforcement. It also establishes nationwide standards for sports agents, protecting college athletes from exploitation. At the same time, the bill does not ignore more foundational issues impacting the entire ecosystem, especially emerging governance and revenue challenges. It acknowledges the role of conferences, institutions, and governing bodies, and it seeks to bring clarity and stability to a landscape that is currently defined by uncertainty and litigation through a 2-year congressional commission structured in much the same way as today's program. It protects Title IX and women's sports explicitly, not as an afterthought or a footnote. And it recognizes that if college athletics is going to remain a national institution rather than a professionalized free-for-all, there must be rules that are fair, transparent, and legally sound. The College Athletics Reform Act also makes intentional choices about what not to include. Most importantly, the College Athletics Reform Act does not attempt to short-circuit the law by granting blanket antitrust immunity. Instead, it respects the role of the courts while encouraging a system that aligns incentives rather than suppressing rights. Neither does it pursue broad preemption, opting instead to set strong floors atop which state legislatures can introduce legislation to protect their athletes. Now, I do not pretend that my bill is perfect. I like it, but I know that there's disagreement on that. It's one proposal informed by many conversations with athletes, administrators, advocates, economists, legal experts, all offered in good faith as a starting point rather than a final answer. Those are just my thoughts. And the beauty of Congress is that my vote counts the same as the vote of a colleague who believes that we should sell the farm so that the NCAA can get an antitrust exemption forever. That's just how this institution works. We are a collection of strong opinions, deeply held beliefs, and competing priorities. The challenge and the responsibility lies in bringing those voices together to see if and where we can find common ground, to determine whether there is a path forward that protects athletes, preserves opportunity, and sustains college sports for the next generation. And that's why today's conversation is so important, and that's what it's designed to do. Today is about hitting restart on a conversation about college athletics here in Congress. It's about moving past the talking points and toward consensus, substance. It's about listening, especially to the voices that have too often been excluded. And it's about demonstrating that compromise is possible, or at least clarifying where the real lines are. If there is a path forward to be found, it will start in rooms like this one, well, beautiful rooms like this one, with conversations like the ones we're about to have. So I want to thank you all again for being here. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'd like to invite our first panel up to the stage so that we can get started. Okay, our first panel of the day, while everyone gets seated, is titled Towards an Enduring Governance Model. Our moderator and our panelists are kindly joining me on the stage. I'll talk a little bit about the goal of the panel, and I'm going to introduce them. It's no secret that college athletics is in urgent need of governance reform. Over the past several years, the ground has shifted dramatically. The Supreme Court's Alston decision, the House settlement, and dozens of state NIL laws have fundamentally changed how college sports operate. Athletes today have unprecedented ability to monetize their name, image, and likeness, to transfer between institutions, and to fully exhaust their eligibility. Those changes represent real and meaningful progress for athletes, but at the same time, the rapid unraveling of the legacy governance model has created instability in the ecosystem. The NCAA, conferences, schools, coaches, players, and fans are all navigating uncertainty, and more of them are looking to Congress for clarity and solutions. That raises some foundational questions that this panel is uniquely positioned to explore. How, if at all, should Congress intervene? Should lawmakers grant the NCAA, conferences, or emerging enforcement bodies like the College Sports Commission some form of antitrust exemption? Or should Congress instead move toward a collective bargaining framework modeled after professional sports leagues, as a growing chorus of stakeholders is now advocating? Beyond those big picture questions, there are also urgent unsolved issues that demand attention. Conflicting state NIL laws, predatory agents and bad actors exploiting athletes, and loopholes in the current system that disproportionately harm international college athletes. This panel will examine both the immediate steps Congress could take and the longer-term legislative framework needed to establish a stable, equitable governance model for the future of college athletics. So we are fortunate to have an outstanding group to lead this conversation, starting with our moderator, Gabe Feldman. Gabe Feldman is the Sher Garner Professor of Sports Law and Paul and Abram B. Barron Professor of Law at Tulane University. He serves as director of the Tulane Sports Law Program, associate provost for NCAA compliance, and co-director of the Tulane Center for Sports. Many of you may also know him as an NFL Network legal analyst, a sports industry consultant, and the host of SportsWise, a podcast about sports and law. There are few people better equipped to guide a conversation at the intersection of athletics, law, and policy. Thank you. Joining Gabe are our four exceptional panelists. Val Ackerman is the commissioner of the Big East Conference. She's a founding president of the WNBA, former NBA executive and attorney, a past president of USA Basketball, and a two-time U.S. representative to FIBA. Val has been inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame and the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame, and her leadership has shaped college and professional sports for decades. David White is the executive director of the NFL Players Association, one of the most respected labor leaders in the country. He previously led SAG-AFTRA through its historic merger. He's a Rhodes Scholar, a Stanford Law graduate, and a former college football quarterback. His experience negotiating complex labor frameworks brings invaluable perspective to today's conversation. And finally, Brandon Copeland is the co-founder and executive director of Athletes.org, an emerging players association for college athletes. A former NFL veteran and Penn graduate, Brandon has become one of the leading voices for athlete advocacy, financial education, and representation, ensuring that athletes are heard in decisions that shape their futures. And finally, Julia Duncan is the Deputy Chief of Public Affairs for the American Association for Justice. She's a longtime advocate for consumer, worker, and athlete rights with deep expertise in accountability, enforcement, and protecting vulnerable populations within complex systems. We're grateful to all of you for being here, and I'm looking forward to a thoughtful, candid discussion. Gabe, it's all you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for that smattering of polite applause. But Congresswoman, thank you for hosting this and giving us the opportunity to have this important conversation. And thank you for all that you do with your staff to try to help us navigate these challenging times in college sports. And I think, as most of us recognize, with these challenging times come a lot of opportunity. And we are probably at the most pivotal point in the history of college sports as we know it. And the story is still left to be told of how things shake out. And so it's conversations like this that are so important to hear from all different perspectives on how we can best solve the issues that we're facing so we can protect this thing that so many of us love, and that's college sports, and that's all aspects of college sports. So I'm honored to be here moderating. Appreciate your participation. And I want to start big picture, and Val, I'll start with you. Just given your role as a former student athlete, now commissioner of the Big East, you've had a lot of experience on every level of professional and college sports. But can you just give us a little bit of the lay of the land? Because there's a lot of discussion about the problems facing college sports, the crises, where we are, where we were, where we might be headed. I think it'd be helpful for you to kind of just give us a lay of the land of what is the current state of college sports in about 95 seconds.
Oh, great. Okay, that's easy. Well, that's why I had to write this down, Gabe, because there was, a lot to say here. First of all, I want to thank the Congresswoman very much for giving this opportunity to air out some issues, and your leadership is going to be critically important as we endeavor to hold on to all the good things about college sports, and I think that's where I mostly want to start. Has been noted, I have had a front row seat on all of the positives, many of them related to college sports in the course of my career. I was a student athlete myself, like the Congresswoman. I played basketball at the University of Virginia in the early years of Title IX. In my case, it was sort of the gift that keeps on giving. I got a full scholarship, wound up with a debt-free education. I graduated with a degree, and am now part of a network of alums that's proven to be an outstanding support group for me at varying stages in my career. And the life skills and leadership training that I got playing basketball at Virginia has helped me in many ways personally and professionally. It's my observation that many athletes are still getting the benefit of those very same connections with their universities when they play sports. And I think whatever we do, we've got to try to find a way to hold on to all of those good benefits. And and what I consider a pretty good quid pro quo. You play at your school and you get all these benefits in return. So that's what I hope this endeavor, can bring us to. Where, I would say college sports have struggled in recent years is adapting to the reality that certain sports in certain schools have proven to be increasingly commercially attractive to broadcast networks and to sponsors and to fans who express their support through ticket sales and merchandise sales and the like. Because of those commercial outcomes, the athletes in those sports have rightly said, hey, wait a minute, that old quid pro quo may not be enough anymore. It may not be enough to get a scholarship and all the benefits that go along with that. We'd like to share in the rewards that are coming our way. And so hence, that has brought us litigation. That's brought us the Alston outcomes with non-cash academic awards, with cost of attendance payments, with NIL opportunities, and of course now revenue sharing under the House settlement. Revenue sharing works if there is enough athletics revenue to share with athletes, and that seems to be the case with a lot of the bigger schools. But in many schools, that athletics revenue isn't there in the quantity needed to support operations at the current level and then compensate the athletes on top of that. And I worry about that, which is in the quest, the zeal to maintain a competitive advantage or attempt to remain competitive in sports like football and basketball especially, that you're going to see schools looking for alternative revenue streams from donors, from institutional subsidies in order to sort of keep up with the schools that have the revenue to share on that. And I do wonder and worry about the economic sustainability of that model. The other note, Gabe, a couple of other notes here, I would just say, and the Congresswoman alluded to this, we are in the midst of a legal quagmire because a number of federal laws are right now colliding in the college sports sector. We have continuing questions about the application of the labor and employment laws, about antitrust law, about Title IX, importantly, about tax laws. And I really do believe that because they're all federal laws, Congress is in the best position to attempt to reconcile them in a way that's fair for the athletes and the schools, and to keep the decision-making about which laws apply in which way out of the hands of a disparate group of judges around the country, which is what's happening now, and that's also creating confusion. As it relates to governance, I will say that we need a national framework in order to manage college sports because of the national nature of these competitions. Schools are playing each other all over the country and ultimately striving for the ultimate prize, which is a national championship in a sport. And in order to have orderly competition that's fair and predictable, we do need a basic framework that's immune from challenge, so that athletes and schools and fans, most of all, know what's happening. And so whether it's the NCAA or some other national governing body, that should be an end result for all of us. One note I would sort of offer as well, having been in the system now for 12 years, the decision making, it's probably a lot like Congress. It's made by the members. NCAA is a membership association. So decisions and policies are made by committees made up of who? Representatives from the schools and the conferences. And that has worked pretty well up until now, but I worry about interests taking over. Sometimes it's not easy to put aside the interests of your school or your conference and look for the greater good. And it may well be, Congresswoman, that there's an alternative, more independent governance structure that we could use to create, to eliminate the possibility of those conflicts and come up with fair decision making. And as you noted, the College Sports Commission, which is independent, is a first step in that direction. The last thing I would note is we do need to find a way to make sure that the athletes do have the voice they deserve in the governance structure. It's better now. There's more athletes involved in committees and the like than ever before, and that's a positive. But how we can continue to make sure that their voices are heard, the system that everybody agrees to is, as I said, fair and predictable, is a work in progress. I know that Brandon has some interesting thoughts about how bargaining might work, particularly if we're in a non-employment session, and I think we need to listen hard to that possibility. But again, there's really, Abe, I don't know, Abe, there's so much going on here. That was just sort of my effort to offer up a couple of other thoughts. And again, I just want to thank the folks who are here for your interest in this, and the Congresswoman and her colleagues for everything you're doing to try to galvanize the discussion and get us to where we need to be.
Thank you, Val. And that was a perfect segue to my next question. And I'm going to turn to both David and Brandon in the discussion of athlete rights and athlete involvement. And I think one of the reasons we are here today is because many would agree that the NCAA was too restrictive on athletes for too long, did not give athletes enough of a voice, and eventually led to this player empowerment movement that we're seeing not just in college athletics, but over the last 25 years, you've seen a lot of what you could call the sort of athlete exploitation cases, whether it's college athletes, minor league baseball players, there's some people in here who've worked on those cases, cheerleaders, golf caddies, a lot of people who were helping generate revenue but were limited in the piece of that revenue that they could get. And the law, the policy, the public, Congress is saying, well, maybe we need to take a closer look at this. And one of those potential solutions in college sports that has been floated has been a players' union. So, David, I want to start with you as the new head of the NFL Players Association, which is in some ways maybe the most well-known and certainly most scrutinized union in the country. Can you talk about, if we are going to potentially think of a college athlete union as a solution, can you tell us from the pro-athlete perspective what the union does and how it benefits your constituents and how you think it might apply to college athletes? And then, Brandon, we'll go to you to talk about your thoughts on this.
Sure. Thank you. And let me begin by adding my statement of appreciation and thanks for the work that you do and what your colleagues do, and also for the forum. At a base level, collective bargaining, we're fans of collective bargaining, obviously, and it starts with ensuring that the athlete's perspective and the player's interest is at the center of the conversation or whatever activity that we're talking about. So respect, voice, fairness, these are things that are critical for a person to walk through the world with dignity. And when you're talking about athletes, college, professional, etc., that has to be more than just a statement of, we'd like to hear your voice. That requires a structure that allows the athlete to actually have a place at the table and to also have the power is the word that comes to mind, but the leverage to move things and to have an exchange with the other interests and the other powers around the table. And collective bargaining provides a terrific framework for doing that. Most people do or should know that collective bargaining also provides a way for there to be fair compensation, health benefits, the full range of working conditions. It's important that representatives of the unit, the bargaining unit, representatives of the voice, in this instance athletes, are there at the table, because the level of nuance that is required to really understand what the daily life, what the daily grind, what the cumulative impact of athletics has on body, mind, mindset, future, etc. You can only really do that by having representatives from the group that is at the subject of the conversation there at the table. So I've certainly seen this in the entertainment industry, and I've seen it in sports. It's critical all the way around. And I will also say this: collective bargaining and having a union at the professional level, it's also good for the league. Otherwise, the league itself will be chaotic. it's, the NFL is well known for having made the essential and very strategic decision early on, 50s, 60s, but even before then, as they were thinking about this, how do we have parity? How do you actually understand, how do you actually grow the league? And you grow the league by having real competition. And that provided structure and order, and we can talk about just people loving the game of football or loving the game of professional sports, but really the reason why there has been such a rise and the reason why there has been such growth, commercially and otherwise, is because of the series, many of which are hidden, of decisions that ensure that there is fair play. And the union's role in that, if you didn't have the union and you're actually dealing with 2,200 plus athletes and their representatives, their agents, you would just have chaos. So the unions, the Players Association, have been a key piece of that. So I think it provides benefit on both sides.
Great. And Brandon, I'll come to you in a second. And then anybody else feel free to jump in too on this particular issue. But one of the other benefits, as many people have talked about, of having a players union is that the union can then negotiate with the league as one, even though the league is 32 individual competitors, but their agreements are then protected under antitrust attack. So when the Players Association does agree to something like a salary cap or a draft or other free agent restrictions, those are protected from antitrust attack. So that's another benefit that flows to the league, and flows so much that, in fact, 15 years ago, and then prior to that and after that, there was a fight about whether the NFL Players Union still existed as a union, but the players were the ones who were saying there was no union because they wanted to bring an antitrust attack, and the league was saying there was a union because they didn't want to be sued under antitrust law. There is no other industry in this country that would have that type of fight other than professional sports and now potentially college sports. So Brandon, you have spent a lot of time talking about thinking about the benefits of collective bargaining, of a players association. You received the benefits of it during your career as an NFL player. Tell us your thoughts on how it might look if applied to college athletes.
Yeah, I think, one, thank you, Congresswoman, and your team for having us here. As everyone else has said, this is incredible. It's great to have these conversations in front of people who care and want to talk about it openly and publicly. What I always say is, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you'll end up on the menu. And when you think about college athletes, as the game has evolved, when the tough money decisions start to be made, the athletes always end up on the menu. I am an undrafted free agent out of University of Pennsylvania. 2013, I came to the Baltimore Ravens, which is my hometown team. And without the NFLPA, I would have played for the Baltimore Ravens for a great look at Ray Lewis's locker and some double mint gum and some free Gatorade, too. You'd have to throw that in. But the NFLPA, without me knowing or understanding my value at the time, has negotiated for the minimum way that you can treat me, right? And a lot of times for us as NFL players, we come into the league thinking because we're so good that the NFL always wanted to give us a 401k match, and they wanted to give us tuition reimbursement, and they wanted to give us this beautiful rookie compensation, the minimum compensation. But really, folks like my grandfather, who played from 1965 through 76, fought for that. His teammate, John Mackey, helped start and propel the NFLPA as well, too. And so today, as you said, we're in a very pivotal time in college athletics, and while the NCAA, the conferences, and the schools, and not all of them, but because some of them behind closed doors will tell you that they are 100% for collective bargaining and doing this the way that has worked at the pro level time and time again. But while publicly the NCAA, the conferences, and the schools are coming out saying, hey, times are tough right now. This is unsustainable. We cannot control our athletes. We need to build a real business model. The only things that have changed are athletes actually have rights and freedom to choose. And unfortunately, because the athletes don't have the different networks and the different media folks at their disposal, so to speak, you only get to hear one side of the story, right? So right now, if you look on Instagram and your algorithm pushes college athletics news in front of you, you'll see that, there's a record amount of football players in the transfer portal right now, over 10,000. But what it doesn't share, and we have some football players in the room, college football players in the room, current ones, what it doesn't share is that a lot of those athletes are also being pushed off of their teams, right? Not every athlete is saying, hey, let me jump in the transfer portal because I want to go make money. And so, there's this push by the conferences, the schools, and the NCAA to say, hey, let me get an antitrust exemption. Let us create these rules and this structure so that we can build sustainably from here on out. But from my seat and my perspective, it would be, hey, right now the athletes aren't in power. They don't have a seat at the table. And the leadership, and I'm not blaming you, Val, I just want to be clear. We're on the same page here. We're on the same team here, okay? But the leadership that has gotten us here is not the athletes' leadership, right? So you want to give a serial antitrust violator an antitrust exemption, and their leadership has got us to this point. Why would we do that? Why would we even consider that? And by doing collective bargaining and making sure athletes have, as you said, David, power at that table, not just a seat at the table, right? Because a lot of times people say, hey, SAC, Student Athlete Advisory Committee, is the thing. That gets your voices out. Or we'll put a couple of athletes on this committee. And again, I was on SAC when I was in college, and I'll tell people with a straight face, I showed up for the free Chipotle. That was it. I was not capable of negotiating a multi-billion-dollar deal as a sophomore in college. I just wasn't, right? I need a players association to go out there and give me the tools to take my experiences to then go formulate it into some real regulation and governance that helps me enhance my college career and protects me, because that's what I need right now. And so finally, making sure that athletes not only have that mechanism to collectively bargain and negotiate the rules of their play, transfer portal, which is really free agency, revenue share cap, which is really a salary cap, right? Health insurance and benefits and things of that nature, that not only protects them today, but it also protects them as this game evolves. As you see more people flirting with the ideas of private equity in college sports, and now the conflicts of interest between athlete development and drive revenue will continue to butt heads. I would want athletes, especially college athletes, my sons, one day, I have 3 boys, so I'm going to say my sons, but if you all have sons and daughters, my sons and daughters, I want them one day to make sure that they're protected by a real legitimate players association that cares and fights for their interests and their interests alone at those tables.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. I do want to come back to the unionization, collective bargaining, employment issue, but Julia, I'm going to come to you to talk about the legislation. But there is one parallel that's a little hard to ignore, and sometimes we forget that some of these issues have been debated before in other contexts, and we can learn lessons from them. But if you think back to Major League Baseball in the early 1900s, baseball players were told, even though they were professional, that you should just be glad you get to wear the pinstripes, and that whatever salary we give you should be enough, and that everybody else in the country would die to be in the position you're in where you get to play a sport for a living. And our Supreme Court actually did give an antitrust exemption to baseball to try to protect that. And so what did the players turn to in the absence of antitrust law is they turned to a union. They had the ability to form a union and then gain rights through collective bargaining. It's interesting, and I'm just observing this, not passing judgment either way, but we're at a situation for college athletes where if there is an antitrust exemption passed and there is no collective bargaining right, then you've left the college athlete with neither avenue, neither antitrust law nor labor law, which would be a unique situation as far as I can tell in the history of employment. Now that may be the answer. That may be where we end up. Again, I'm not doing this to judge, but just to point out some parallels that have happened in a very similar industry. So if you want to hear more about that, you can listen to my podcast or sign up for my Tulane classes. Okay, Julia, you are here on the ground. You are working in governmental affairs. You spend a lot of time on these issues. Can you give us your perspective on the legislation that is out there and where you see things potentially headed?
Yeah. So a lot of really good questions are being raised here. And in full transparency, there are only 2 things of which I am absolutely sure. The first is that I know the least amount about college sports of everyone on the panel. And the second is that rights that are not legally enforceable are meaningless to the people they are meant to protect. They mean absolutely nothing. So when we talk about pieces of legislation moving through Congress, and there's a lot of good words in a lot of the legislation that is moving, the SCORE Act that was being contemplated on the House floor. There's a lot of good words in there about protections and new mechanisms for college athletes. In the SCORE Act, there is not one legally enforceable right by the athletes themselves. And so it's like if you and I enter into a contract, right, and you say, we're going to enter into a contract, and I'm going to do these things, and this is what I'm going to pay you for them, and you're going to do these things, and this is going to be the exchange, and we're going to enter this contract, and it's a great deal for you. And then they would say to me, but if I breach this contract, meaning if I don't hold up my end of the bargain, you have no rights. You cannot tell anyone about that. You can't go to a court and say, I held up my end of the bargain. I performed. I worked hard. And the other side is saying, well, yeah, I know we promised you these things, but we can't really ever be held accountable in a court of law if we don't do these things. And what Brandon just said is supremely important. Everybody wants to give college athletes a seat at the table, right? Everybody's saying we have to listen to the college athletes. We have to protect the college athletes. A seat at the table, if your voice has no legally enforceable power, is meaningless. And so the SCORE Act calls for these new associations to be created. And they're going to write rules. They're supposed to write rules under the SCORE Act about things that are going to hopefully make life better, both student life and college athlete life better. The provisions of that, though, you have to look really carefully. The associations, the only requirement in the SCORE Act is that college athletes make up 20%, at least 20%. I mean, at maximum 20%, which means 80% of the membership that are going to be making these rules and enforcing these rules and deciding if the schools are complying with the rules are not college athletes. And so in that circumstance, when college athletes are saying, wait a minute, I advocated for these rules and I was supposed to be given these protections, given these educational benefits, and my institution, the NCAA, is not holding up its end of the bargain, where are they to go? They go to the same associations that are 80% controlled by people who are not college athletes. At the same time, the SCORE Act preempts state labor protections, so you can no longer go to state law for help. You can't go to state judges and say they're not doing what they promised they would do. And they're getting rid of antitrust laws. And it's important to remember the only reason we're here having this conversation and the state of college sports is what it is today is because of lawsuits. The only reason we are having this conversation is college athletes starting long ago before we all were caring about this issue, college athletes were fighting through courts, through their own advocacy, to secure rights to which they believed they were entitled. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, which does not happen very often, said, yes, college athletes are entitled to these protections under federal law. And now the NCAA is saying, okay, we were made to do these things under this law that made it to the courts, and now we want to be immune from that law. And just trust us when we tell you that now that we've been held accountable, both by the United States Supreme Court and by a settlement, which has, pluses and minuses in it, that we then deserve immunity from ever being held accountable again. So to make the same mistakes that we were facing in the past that landed us here is, in my opinion, crazy. And we need to be talking about rights and protections that can not only exist in theory and out there, but that can be legally enforceable in courts of law. And I would offer, lastly, that, there's a lot of, I'm not saying courts are perfect. They're not. We should be funding courts more. We should be protecting judges. And I feel that way for court decisions I vehemently disagree with. And I feel that way for court decisions that I agree with. We could do better. It is an imperfect system. But it is a system meant to decide which federal laws apply to which types of cases. It is a system that can decide when preemption of state law is appropriate. It is unconstitutional to require any entity currently under law. We don't need to do anything now. The 10th Amendment says you can't be forced, no company, no entity can be forced to comply with two different laws that it would be impossible to do. It's called impossibility preemption. And judges and courts all over the country can decide those things. That's an entirely appropriate area for the courts to decide. Are they too slow? Yes. Do we need clarity? But this is a baby area of litigation, and we are getting clarity when people who are most impacted, the college athlete themselves, can speak for themselves, and they don't have to depend on a governmental entity, and they don't have to depend on an association where they have a minority voice in the decisions that are made. And any legislation, in my view, that moves forward needs to protect the legally enforceable rights of those the legislation is supposed to protect.
Thank you, Julia. And just to play devil's advocate for a second, and not to say that the NCAA is the devil in this scenario, but for devil's advocate in the immunity piece, that I think the NCAA would concede we are seeking immunity because the things we're doing are being struck down as illegal. That's why we need the immunity. It's like if my son comes to me and says, can you promise I won't get in trouble if I wrote in Sharpie marker on our couches? I have a pretty good idea of why he's asking for that immunity because of what he's doing. But the question, all right, maybe that analogy sounded better in my head, but the question that I think comes out of this, to come back to the collective bargaining and unionization issue, employment is one way to get to some of this stability and the certainty through collective bargaining. Let's say, for sake of argument, this is for anyone who wants to jump in, what if athletes are not classified as employees, either because they're prohibited through federal law or just because the law is silent as to it and it works its way through the courts and the courts say, no, we don't think they're employees, we think they are, the economic reality is something different. What then, if it's not enough to have, and I've held back on trying to sing in the room where it happens, but what if it's just a seat at the table, but there is no federal mechanism through a union to require bargaining with the other side? What then, and maybe Brandon, I'll start with you, what can the players do in that?
Well, I'm going to end up throwing an alley-oop here to David, but I think with SAG, right, the actors and actresses, they're not employees of their movies or films or production studios, but they still have the protections that SAG-AFTRA has negotiated for them, right?
No, they're employees.
They are?
Yeah, they are. I mean, you're probably thinking that they were independent contractors, but
yes.
No, but they're employees. They're classified as employees.
Okay, so nix that argument right there.
No, but I'll take the alley-oop. Thank you. If that were to be the case, then you would want a modified version of still having the athletes represented, their own voice represented, and still at the table with leverage. So what some legislation is attempting to do is to establish a floor, so there are certain things that don't actually have to be negotiated, and then ensuring that there is an empowered right when they're at the table to push for more, but nothing goes below that floor. And so the regime that we have right now has people classified as workers, which carries a lot of other luggage. We understand that. And we're comfortable with that in the employee setting. But if college, because of the unique characteristics of a student's life for 4+ years, didn't allow for that, then you have a modified version of it. But the key thing is having the floor and having standards and ensuring that the athlete's voice is at the center of the conversation that is going to involve the life of a college athlete.
And one quick follow-up on that, and then Val, I want to come back to you just to talk about the state of college sports and non-football programs. But as a union leader, and as a longtime union leader, do you think in general, I know you can't speak for all union leaders, but do you think in general union leaders would be okay with the formation of something that is not quite a union, that is sort of a quasi-union, that does get those floors that are maybe federally mandated, and then they can try to bargain for more, but not in the context of a union? Do you think that hybrid model is okay for union leaders who I think traditionally would want everything to be in a union?
This is a trap.
All right, that's all we have time for today.
I will channel my labor colleagues and say the labor regime that we have in this country right now it's mature, it's gone through so many battles and nuances, and it works in many ways, and that's first prize. But the context of the question was if that was nixed by the courts, and in that instance, then we find compromise. You've got to be able to stick and move.
Right. Yeah. Can't get the number one option. Let's try to find something that's second best. Yeah. Okay. Val, back to you, and then anybody feel free to jump in the last couple of minutes on any area that we've touched on. But most of the discussion is driven by football at the top level. And with the college football playoffs, national championship coming up, we know that's what's driving most of the revenue decisions, the conference decisions, the transfer decisions, that football is sort of in its own category, and maybe it makes sense, as the Knight Commission has suggested, to have separate governance of football. But from your perspective as the commissioner of the Big East, where you're in a unique position where, for many of us, myself included, grew up as college basketball fans and love college basketball. And when you think of the beauty of college sports, think of men's and women's basketball and March Madness and Cinderella stories. How do the basketball-centric schools fit into this when the conversation is so dominated by football?
Well, we work hard to stay in the conversation for sure, because to your point, a lot of this is about football. And a lot of the decision-making that's been made has to do with how's this going to work for football, and sometimes what it means for other sports is frankly an afterthought, has been my observation. I will say, back to the quasi-union idea, I just want to jump in. That sort of has been my kind of thought at some point, was maybe there is a special status here. Maybe it's, a recognition that college sports isn't like other industries. And maybe the traditional constructs around labor and employment and so on just don't apply, and maybe we do have to come up, and may require more detail than you would normally want to see in a federal bill, but that could be the way out, and it could be maybe restricted to certain sports. I do think in college sports you've got sort of football here, with its particularly at the highest levels. FCS football maybe has some different considerations than FBS. You've got college basketball in a very unique position, because for the NCAA, that's the primary revenue stream. The NCAA is powered by the revenues from March Madness every year. And that's paying for all the other sports that the NCAA manages with respect to their championship management and the like. So there does need to be special care applied to how we're going to run basketball in our country. And I will tell you right now, Gabe and colleagues here, we are struggling with how the transfer portal is affecting basketball. We're struggling with eligibility challenges, where you've got athletes playing 4 years and saying, hey, how come I only get 4 years of this? This is a great deal. I can get paid now. And what we don't want, I don't want, is, 30-year-olds playing college basketball because somebody decided that, we weren't able to put caps on eligibility and seasons of competition. So I do think maybe college basketball is sort of a separate entity. And then, of course, we've got Olympic sports in their own sort of sphere. And that's one, Congressman, where I do wonder if perhaps there's better collaborations with the USOPC. There has been some dialogue over the years about how to bring together the national governing bodies in various sports with the college version of that sport, and maybe sort of treat sports like a vertical. And I do think we could, maybe give some more thought to how to do that in a way that would guarantee that the broad-based programming that you referred to in your opening remarks can be held onto. Because I do worry, as more money gets funneled into football and basketball, I do worry, with finite resources, and that's partly our dilemma, Gabe. What's going to give? And it may well be that some of the things that I addressed in my opening remarks about, the benefits of college sports to athletes. We've got 550,000 student athletes now, and they're all important, and we want to make sure they're all protected, but it may require, really some interesting constructions and reimagination of the way we're doing things.
Great, thanks, Val. I think we have 22 seconds, so I'm going to give Brandon and Julie each 11 seconds, but I do want to just pick up on something Val said, that we spent a long time watching college athletes fight to leave college early so that they could make more money. And now we're seeing college athletes fight to stay longer in college so they can make more money. So the world has changed quite a bit. But Brandon or Julia, if you 10 seconds plus or minus 1 second.
Yeah, I think, college athletes are in this system right now, and they are under a lot of pressure. And unfortunately, we are continuing to find ways to talk around them and leave them out of the conversation on the things that they are dealing with and living under. Athletes.org, we've built the Players Association for College Athletes, over 5,100 of them, and we give them true benefits today. Free second medical opinions, contract review from lawyers, giving them pro bono hours. But one of the benefits that I was surprised by is our most used is mental wellness resources. So more athletes are reaching out to us to try to get connected to therapists and psychiatrists and other pro athletes who want to talk them through some things, right? And so, again, I just urge everyone in this room to continue to push for athletes to not only, be heard, but actually have a real seat at the table that can protect them now and far into the future.
Great, thank you. And Julia, last word.
Yeah. I feel like it's important to clarify something, and I think it's a really important point, both in this conversation and a lot of conversations that are happening, which is for impacted communities, college athletes. I work with survivors of all kinds of horrific things, survivors of sexual assault, survivors of employment discrimination across the board, consumers who have lost everything. And what I can tell you for sure is that when those impacted communities turn to the courts, it is a last resort. And it is a last resort because they do not feel heard, empowered, respected, or they feel like rights have been taken away from them in an illegal manner. It is a last resort. And in the courts, antitrust cases are not easy to win for the victims, for college athletes. In fact, under certain standards, defendants in antitrust cases win 90% of the time. These cases are difficult, they're expensive, and they are a last resort. But having that there gives leverage and life to all of the things we're talking about in terms of empowerment, having a seat at the table, and having that voice be respected. Because others know that if we don't hold up our end of the bargain, if we don't do what is being promised, we can be held legally accountable. And that's why it's so critical as part of all of these conversations.
Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you all for your passion, your insight, your expertise. And again, thank you, Congresswoman, for giving us the opportunity to speak.
Okay. If you observed on the agenda, there are 0 breaks, which is not how I run my office. I just want you all to know. We're encouraging you to grab snacks, grab coffee, take a biotechnological break as you need it. We're going to keep the day moving. First, just want to thank our first panel and our moderator. What a thoughtful and substantive discussion. They truly helped set the tone for the day, and they framed the hard questions Congress will continue to wrestle with as we think about the future governance of college athletics. And just one other thing. For those of you, so I wasn't a basketball player in college. despite my height. That's why I mispronounce FIBA. I hyper-focus on these things after I do them, and I think I saw a couple chuckles over here. So sorry to Val, sorry to all the women's basketball players. I now know FIBA, not FIBA. Okay. We're going to turn to our second panel titled Strengthening Women's and Olympic Sports. This conversation could not be more timely or more urgent. While the House settlement marks a landmark moment in the evolution of athlete compensation, it also poses serious risks, particularly for women athletes and those competing in Olympic sports. Even before the settlement, we were already seeing a widening revenue gap that allowed the Power II conferences to pull away from the rest of the ecosystem. Smaller schools trying to remain competitive increasingly funneled scarce resources into football and men's basketball, often at the expense of everything else. And in the post-settlement landscape, that pressure has only intensified. Many schools are now implementing revenue-sharing models that allocate upwards of 90% of shared funds to just two sports. The consequences of those choices are no longer theoretical. According to a report released by Senate Commerce Ranking Member Maria Cantwell, since May of last year, 41 Division I Olympic sports programs have been eliminated, affecting more than 1,000 athletes. These are athletes who trained for years, often with Olympic aspirations, only to see their opportunities disappear overnight. At the same time, the enforcement landscape has grown increasingly fragile. Title IX guidance on revenue sharing was rescinded last year. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the federal government's primary Title IX enforcement body, has been significantly weakened. And new enforcement structures like the College Sports Commission risk further limiting women athletes' earning potential by imposing new standards and restrictions on NIL deals. So the question facing Congress is clear. How do we protect women in Olympic sports in this new era of college athletics, not just rhetorically, but in practice? We're fortunate to have an exceptional group to tackle that very question, led by our moderator, my colleague, my friend, Congresswoman Teresa Leger Fernandez. Chair Leger Fernandez represents New Mexico's 3rd Congressional District and serves as the chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus. A 17th generation New Mexican, she is a Yale graduate, Stanford Law alumna, who began her education in New Mexico's first Head Start class. Before Congress, she was a public interest lawyer advancing voting rights, tribal sovereignty, environmental protection, and access to education and health care. In Congress, she serves on the House Rules Committee and the Natural Resources Committee, where she is ranking member of the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs. And I'd kick myself if I also didn't point out that she is a valued member of the Congressional Women's Softball Team, which takes on the Women in Media team every year. Chair Leger Fernandez and commitment to equity make her an ideal person to guide the panel discussion. And joining her are 4 outstanding panelists. Megan Burke is the executive director of the National Women's Soccer League Players Association and a former professional goalkeeper. An attorney and civil rights advocate, Megan has led transformative labor reforms in women's soccer, negotiating landmark collective bargaining agreements that delivered guaranteed contracts, free agency, and stronger player protections. Michaela Pivick is a professional women's basketball player and co-founder of the United College Athletes Association. A former Oregon State standout and WNBA draft pick, she now works to secure fair pay, protections, and a real voice for women's college basketball players through player-led advocacy. Joel Rosenbaum is chair of the Team USA Athletes Commission and a 4-time USA Para-Triathlon national champion. He brings the perspective of elite Olympic and Paralympic athletes and has extensive leadership experience across the Olympic movement. And Lee Ernst Friestedt is the founder of Equity 9, a law firm focused on Title IX, women's sports, and NIL. A former Division I athlete herself, Lee has spent her career advocating for gender equity and currently represents athletes challenging the House settlement. This panel will confront some of the hardest questions we face about equity, enforcement, and the future of opportunity in college sports. I'm so grateful for all of you being here, and it is my pleasure to turn it over to Chair Leger Fernandez to get us started.
Thank you, Lori. Let's all give it up to Representative Lori Trahan, because she's the reason we are here. She's the reason we are here. And let me tell you, the Democratic Women's Caucus, we are 96 women strong. It is historic, but actually our historic number was 97, but then one of us went off and decided to be governor of New Jersey. So we're back down to 96. And I think we represent all women in America because we have gone through the struggles of what women in America face. We are also experts in all kinds of fields, including in Title IX. And what does it mean to end up being able to go to college on a sports scholarship, like Lori did, and have that transform your life, and then to be able to come back here and say, let's keep talking about how we need to preserve the opportunities I had that come through Title IX. Because if not, we don't have the people on this panel, and we don't have Lori. And that's why I think it's so important to be here. I am a proud member of the women's softball team because I am a cancer survivor, and we play against the media in order to raise funds for cancer. And I need to give a shout out because we won this year. We won this year. But I am one of those little girls that was skinny and never got picked for sports. And in rural northern New Mexico, Title IX didn't make it, right? And so I didn't get to see my friends who were incredibly athletic and would have been picked for the team. They had to be cheerleaders because it was the only avenue available to be able to use their athletic talents and gifts. Right? And that is a problem that we face, and that Title IX changed all of that. But we are at a moment when is that going to start slipping back? And so we want to turn to our panels to say, I kind of was like, oh my God, where are we at? That's kind of how in my mind I'm thinking about the question, but you don't want to quite get there, right? I'll try to ask it in a more congressional manner. Because as I think about it, as that little girl who didn't get to do sports, it's not just about making sure that women can go to college on that scholarship, but it's about inspiring everybody. It is about an economy. It is about jobs. It is about all of those who hold our breaths when we keep seeing those three-pointers, right? It's like, woo! And who hold our breaths when there's a Biles 1 and a Biles 2. It's like, and she sticks it right in the hole, and the whole, everybody in the living room jumps up and down, and we're all inspired. So it isn't just about the individuals. It is about who we are as Americans. It is about how we get inspired, and there is an economy behind this. So I'm going to ask you all to talk to us a little bit about what is the impact of the House settlement from your perspective. So Lee, from a Title IX perspective, how has the House settlement accelerated the devaluation of women's sports? In particular, can you speak to how the settlement's rejection of Title IX is reflected in the back pay formulas, how those same thresholds are now being used by schools to justify denying current women athletes meaningful opportunities? And I think everybody here knows what all that means, but share with us what you're seeing from that perspective as an advocate.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here today. And I actually come here today on behalf of not only all the male and female student athletes that I'm currently representing who have courageously objected and are now appealing to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, but all of the objectors and all of the student athletes for the last 10 years, for the next 10 years, who don't have a voice in this process. And I think one of the big concerns I have as an attorney working with my clients is that we really have seen that a lot of the basic facts have really been hidden. So, for example, the House settlement, I think most people don't realize, has two components. It has the past damages payment, which is $2.6 billion. $2.4 billion is allocated to men, $102 million to women. 96% to men, 4% to women. That's not possible in a world where you have Title IX and those payments are going directly from the payment from the universities to the student athletes. That's not equivalent in any sense of this country. On the front side, we now have the revenue sharing payments where the universities for the first time, are afforded the opportunity to pay the student athletes directly in the amount of $20.5 million. And what we are finding is that for the few universities that have kindly disclosed how they're allocating this money, at best, I would say 90+% of it is going to the male athletes and easily less than 10%. And I would say it might be close to 1% for female athletes. So one of the big concerns I have working closely with my athletes, many of whom are current student athletes, and again, when you talk about it is extraordinarily courageous for a current student athlete to stand up, have a voice, and continue to do everything they do at such a high level at these universities. But I would say, the economics behind this is very concerning because it has really just gone to the wayside that the women are, to the extent this is a settlement that's supposed to be unleashing billions of dollars for all of the athletes, they really have left the women behind. And not only are we seeing in the payments, but more concerning to me is with my student athletes who are now seniors, they are receiving less than what they received as a freshman. So let me give you some examples. A lot of student athletes benefited from the Alston decision and were receiving $5,980 in payments. I can tell you at some of the most preeminent sports athletic programs in this country, the female athletes no longer receive those payments because these athletic departments are restructuring their budgets so that they can reallocate the money to pay the men's football and men's basketball players. There are also a lot of marginalizations going along in terms of even the scholarships the women had. For example, things like housing and food allowances, those are now being marginalized. And we're also seeing the participation opportunities for women decreasing because, for example, not just the roster cuts, but the number of female athletes who are actually traveling on these Division I teams. I can tell you I've seen one team that had a Division I program of 42 women. It's decreased to 32. They have the same number of athletes there. So on a high level, we have a lot of concerns in terms of the opportunities that have been afforded to women in the past are actually diminishing and not improving. And this is actually happening right at the critical juncture where I would say that the women are really accelerating. They're accelerating in ways that we've never seen. And so we see women's basketball, and we see women's volleyball, and we see professional women's tennis. We know women are extraordinarily talented. We know women's sports can make money. But this is something that is absolutely not being recognized right now by the House settlement.
Well, let's turn to one of those women athletes who actually went through the college system, played competitively, amazingly. I know you're sad about Oregon and Indiana, but you experienced this firsthand, what it was like to be able to play in college, then to go play professionally. And, as you sit and listen to what Lee shared and think about your own colleagues and teammates, what are you worried about, and what are you seeing from the place where you're sitting and from where you're playing and from your own experience? Share with us, Mika.
Well, so excited to be here along with these amazing leaders. And Lori, thank you for the opportunity again to come here. But it's weird. Like, I'm 28 now, so I'm getting older, pushing 30. But I hate saying, back in my day, but 6 years ago, 2020, I'm a senior at Oregon State. This was pre-NIL. NIL just started the next year in 2021. If a donor tried to buy me a $5 coffee, I could have my eligibility jeopardized and taken away, my pro career potentially gone, as well as I remembered I wanted to do a fundraiser for a local homeless shelter, and NCAA was very guarded about name, image, and likeness. And so I wanted to go through Chipotle, love their burritos, to go and do this fundraiser for a homeless shelter. And my school was like, wait, you gotta wait, we gotta see if the NCAA is okay with it. And just those restrictions was way too much. And I'm so excited about this new era where athletes finally get to benefit the littlest amount in this billion-dollar industry. But I am worried about the money going to women, and I am frustrated in the past too of 7% of schools are actually Title IX compliant, and the mechanisms of enforcement are so frustrating. Thankful for lawyers like Lee who are leading the charge in battling for us women, but there's so many loopholes that schools can get away with, and there needs to be more strengthening of those Title IX enforcement mechanisms through a players' association, through a union, is what I believe in. And right now, the back damages that Lee was talking about were distributed 75% football, 15% men's basketball, 5% women's basketball, 5% Olympics, everyone else. And right now, schools that's not even the floor that schools are operating off right now. They can do whatever they want. They could pay 100% to football. Even if the economist said women's basketball is worth 5%, they can give 0% to women. And so the floor is just way too low for women's basketball, for women's sports, for Olympic sports. We need to raise that floor, I believe, through collective bargaining, through a union. But it's frustrating, and the historical lack of investment in women's sports is infuriating. I remember, I have a hat here with me today that was from the NCAA women's basketball tournament. Played 3 years in it. 4th year, the NCAA tournament was canceled, unfortunately, my senior year. That unfortunate timing, pre-NIL and senior year tournament canceled, but we weren't even allowed to use March Madness branding. We know the weight room scandal in 2021, Sona Prince brought to light, where they thought some yoga mats and some 10-pound weights were enough for us. So it's just been a long list of slights to women, and it's really frustrated me, and we've made a lot of progress, but we still have so much more to go.
Well, the idea that we're going to now slip back through this kind of backward, settlement process, but you actually represent a lot of women like Michaela, although they are kicking the ball instead, right? So why don't you share with us what you were seeing from the players in your sports, and how
Sure.
What are you worried about as you're seeing it?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I want to thank Representative Trahan and all of you. These are the conversations that need to be happening. I really appreciate the diversity of viewpoints and backgrounds that are engaged here. So first of all, I think I'm going to step back for just a moment to answer your question. Just a couple of years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Title IX. A monumental achievement, and I won't talk for hours about Title IX and what it's meant in our sport and in my life, but I would love to do that with anyone who'd like to over a cup of coffee in the back after we're done. Title IX is critically important, not only to why I'm sitting here, why Representative Trahan's sitting here, why you're sitting here, but to the fabric of our country. I'm willing to go that far. The rise in the commercial growth of men's football, men's basketball, men's sports coincided with Title IX. Over this 50-year period. When women thrive, we all thrive. This is not cake where the bigger my slice is, the smaller yours is. It makes all of us better. Now, it's also true that during that 50-year period, there is insufficient enforcement. And we could get into the law of that and why there needed to be more. But I can assure you that after 50 years, we've learned a thing or two about what works. And self-reinforcement does not work. Leaving it to schools to police themselves does not work. Now, in our sport, soccer is my sport, you might have heard of a thing called equal pay. Massive victory for women workers. And what equal pay points out to is a couple things. First of all, that gains for athletes, for workers, is through union organizing, through collective bargaining. Eviscerating collective bargaining rights eviscerates women's rights. Women who are unionized, who are members of a union, make more, they're safer, and they have better working conditions. Those facts apply at the college level. And we can certainly have a conversation about what has worked, but I would submit to you that representing professional athletes, when they go to train and they perform and they entertain, that is work. And what student athletes are doing is work. And people are making money on it. And they should have a seat at the table. In order to respect and protect women's rights, you have to respect and protect the rights of workers to organize. One of the reasons the NWSL Players Association and my sister players associations are deeply concerned about what's happening at the college level right now is that we fight the very same issues every single day. Underinvestment, lack of resources, a lack of belief that women's sports are valuable and to be valued, underinvestment in sponsorship dollars and so on and so forth. And this formula that Lee just did a great job explaining, more than 90% of dollars going to men, pushes these inequities further down the pipeline. Without Title IX, NWSL, WNBA, PWHL, professional volleyball, professional swimming, all of it, none of it exists. Title IX is at the root of it, and that is why I'm here today, to make sure that we protect the essence of what we fought for 50 plus years.
Thank you very much. I just want to say it's also, as we think about professional sports and us being able to show up and we were talking about how now you can go into bars and places, and they're actually on TV are women sports. The women's games are on TV. But every 4 years, we get very excited to see what's happening in the Olympics. And we need to remember that if we don't sort of nurture women athletes through the college system, we don't get women athletes competing for the gold and the silver, the bronze, or competing in a team. Because sometimes it's just amazing how many times do we watch the Olympics and we fall in love with somebody who doesn't win, right? Because we fall in love with that story. And that story is about people coming together and showing us how we're against odds and with persistence and with work. And the human story is so amazing. Tell us about why we should be so concerned that we will start seeing an impact on who gets to perform and inspire us every 4 years at the Olympics.
Yeah, I'm pleased to do that. I first would like to just thank you and thank the Congresswoman for the opportunity to speak. Really excited about it. It's not just every 4 years. It's every 2 years now, right? We have the Winter Games coming up here in a month. And I'm very excited about Team USA and our opportunity for Team USA to compete in Milan and Cortina. When we look at, just real quick, some statistics. Looking back at the Paris Games of 2024, over 75% of Olympic athletes that were there at those games competed in collegiate sports. Over 80% of the winners of medals in the Paris Games competed in collegiate sports. Collegiate sports is the pipeline for athletes to develop into be Olympic and Paralympic athletes, both on the women's, which we've talked about here, but I would also like to say on the men's side too. There are many sports that aren't football, and I would submit to you that the numbers we heard here are mostly around football and men's basketball, not men's diving and men's fencing, for example. Women's and men's collegiate sports really do provide the backline and the pipeline for Olympic sports for our country. And honestly, many other countries across the world wish they had the collegiate system that we do so that they could be better in the Olympic and Paralympic Games. On the Title IX front, women's sports has really propelled Team USA to be the premier women's sports programs in the Olympic and Paralympic stage. Going back to statistics from Paris, over 50% of the medals that Team USA won were won by women. Like, that is an amazing statistic and something we should all be very proud of. And Donna, who's right here in the front, I'll just call you out, one of the architects of Title IX, should be incredibly proud of, because the fact that Team USA does so well and our women do so well is directly correlated to the success of Title IX.
Joel, is that both Paralympics and Olympics and both?
Those statistics are specifically for the Olympics. On the Paralympic side, 53% of Paralympic athletes in Paris competed in collegiate sports.
So, I mean, it shows what a difference it makes in both sides of it, in every 2 years, and for both sets of games every 2 years.
Yes, both sets of games every 2 years. It's incredibly important. It's hard to see how we could be successful without continued investment in broad-based sports at the collegiate level.
Right. So, I'm going to jump a little bit since we happen to be at the Library of Congress, and, we take up... it was wonderful. We actually had Billie Jean King come for the 50th, and we all showed up as, big fangirls and honored the Title IX and honored, those who made it happen. And so thank you so very much. But we also are facing things like the SCORE Act, And the SCORE Act, as you know, we were very worried that it was going to, in many ways, kind of set into legislation some of the worst aspects of House. And thanks to very much the advocacy of Representative Trahan, the Democratic Women's Caucus joined in. We just killed it in the Rules Committee. Oh my God, I was like, we just hit it. And what did they do? They pulled it because they didn't have the votes, but they intended to vote on it. And it was only because enough people raised their voices. And I can't emphasize this enough, especially in corners and in communities of the United States who sometimes maybe don't always pay attention to what's going on here, right? You make the difference. You make such a difference. And especially when the calls come in, when the personal stories come in, when the examples come in. So we'd love to get on the record why you guys don't like the SCORE Act, because they will bring it back. So let me go down. Does anybody who wants to start with the SCORE Act? Why should we vote or not vote for it in its present form?
Well, I have a very simple, short answer. If you look at the most recent version, Section 5.5, it has a provision that most people probably have no idea, which is essentially saying that the universities do not need to be in compliance with Title IX until July 1st, 2027. That is unprecedented in this history to set aside civil rights laws out of, it's mind-boggling. And the way that it's been written is that it references Section 106.41c. I'm sure most people that means nothing. 106.41c, those are the Title IX regulations that outline the 10 factors that athletic programs are supposed to be in compliance with Title IX. So if you eliminate 106.41c compliance for the next 2 years, none of these universities need to be in compliance with Title IX while they go about restructuring their athletic budgets and their systems, and you're going to see not just women's sports impacted, but all of the quote-unquote non-revenue generating sports, the Olympic sports, essentially all of the sports that the universities have decided, along with the NCAA and the athletic conferences, are not going to monetize for them. And that's just under their construct. They've only decided to monetize on football and basketball. We know that many other sports in this country could monetize, but this is the model that they've been advocating for decades now. So my biggest concern was Section 5. In addition to that, I think a lot of people maybe didn't fully understand that, because if you looked at Section 7, it said, wait a minute, don't worry, Title IX is not going to be impacted. So I don't know if they were trying to bifurcate between Title IX regulation and the Title IX statute itself, but that was extraordinarily concerning and unprecedented to try to set aside civil rights laws.
Thank you. Megan, do you want to?
I would love to. Thank you. I have so many things. I think you limited it to one, so I'll do my best. I will co-sign what Lee just said, first of all, and remind everyone in this room that we are talking about nonprofit educational institutions. Your tax dollars fund these institutions. They get tax exemptions. And in return, the promise they make is we will follow federal civil rights, labor laws and other laws that govern the fairness and dignity of students and workers in education and in the workplace. And giving them a pass, they've been required to follow Title IX since the early 70s. They don't need a pass. What we need is enforcement. So that's thing one with the SCORE Act. Thing two, I'll say again what I said earlier, which is stripping women of the right to organize and join a union, strips them of the right to do the very thing that allows them to secure equal pay and protections in the workplace. Union organizing and women's rights go hand in hand. And I could go on, but I will stop there. And I bet my friends here on the panel have something to add.
I'll hop in a little bit. Echo what the fellow co-panelists have said here, but I was nervous when the SCORE Act was going through, and I was like, uh-oh, it's going to pass. And then we got the news. I think Julie Duncan sent an email that, like, woo, the vote has been postponed. And so that was really good news because I was worried, and it just makes you think about all the opportunities that women have had in the past and how, if the SCORE Act had passed, how it would make life so much worse for female athletes. You think about the rev share. If the NCAA got what they wanted, got that salary cap with no floor for women, extremely dangerous. And I believe if that had happened, most of the money, even more of the money, would flow to men, where it would go closer and closer to 100% to zero, as well as the state preemption, limiting access to collective bargaining. And so I'm thankful that it's now seems to be on life support, and hopefully it doesn't come back.
Do you want to add anything, Joel, or are you in a
Sure,
in a position?
I'll add something. I will echo what my panelists here have said too, and I'll take a maybe slightly different tact. I'm the chair of the Athletes Commission for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. If you look at the law that created the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, the Ted Stevens Act and subsequent legislation, it required that athletes be involved, not just have a voice, but have a vote in the operations of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee and all the various NGBs. We feel that athletes having voice and vote, and significant vote, not just token vote, is incredibly important in making sure that athletes' rights get protected in the process. And we feel that's missing the SCORE Act, and we really hope that any legislation about college athletics contains those kind of provisions. I will say the current 33% that's required by the Ted Stevens and subsequent acts, we wish it was more. we would love for it to be more, but it should be at least considered a floor, in our opinion, for what's acceptable.
We are taking suggestions of legislation we will be introducing in 2027. So Lori's writing it down right now. But I think that there are two. I don't know how much time we have, but there were two pieces that I wanted to follow up on that some of the panelists have raised. And one is the importance of organizing, of collective bargaining. And we have, both of you have worked on advocacy. And then the second one is the issue of self-policing, and what do we do? Like, how do we make sure that there is enforcement? That in a moment where we are worried about sliding backwards, and even though they say we're not touching Title IX, when you actually see what the legislation does, and this is why it's key to not pay attention to the darn titles. Like I tell you, you can put something in a title of a bill, and then the bill can do the exact opposite, right? And we're seeing more and more of that happen. So it often does take I love Julian, Section 6, you have to actually go into that. And you have to also have people you trust to be able to explain it. And it sounds like you guys have a great, you have a great community that keeps each other informed, right? But speaking to those two pieces of, and I'll just open up, and you can choose which one you want to talk to. Is like, there's the College Sports Commission proposed, right? But how do we address both of those pieces of how do we enforce, how do we police, and how do we, police is the wrong word in this moment, but how do we make sure people are doing what they're supposed to be doing? And then you've said it often enough, so maybe you want to take the other one, because collective organizing is important, and in this moment it is under attack. But people are recognizing that unions are now have some of the highest popularity that we've seen in a long time. And we had some other votes pulled and taken down across the street because unions came up and said, actually, these are very bad for workers. And so there were 3 bills that we didn't vote on because they had great titles, childcare, but it was going to cut overtime pay if you happen to get childcare. They were interesting, like the titles were the opposite of what they did. So I think it's important to touch on both of these at this moment. So I'll just open that up to the panel. You can choose which one you want to talk about.
Well, by the time you finish the question, we'd already sorted out how we're going to tackle it. That's the value of women playing sports and acquiring those teamwork and life skills. So I'll take the enforcement piece first and keep it really simple. You need to put your money where your mouth is. fund the Department of Education, fund the Civil Rights Division. That is how you enforce Title IX.
Boom. There it is. I'll talk about like the player voice. A lot of these panels today have talked about the player voice, but unions and players associations are the way to make that happen, to facilitate that, where it's not just, we'll listen to you, we'll hear you, but we'll act on it. We're real partners in the business together that the players drive, the players are largely responsible for. And today, we've talked a lot about the money too, and I want to make sure we hit on the health and safety. And so there's a ton of health and safety issues at the college level. I've heard horror stories of players being pushed to play through injuries, pushed to play through concussions, broken ankles, lied to about MRIs, even coaches calling team doctors to try to get the player back faster because the season's coming up and there's pressure to win. And the union is the way to help facilitate that protection and the way to get their voice heard. And in a lot of the spaces right now, SAC, other places, isn't a safe space for athletes to really share how they're feeling. And we want to help create places where athletes can have those real discussions behind closed doors, especially with social media. Like, those aren't safe spaces to talk about these issues. And so, like, I'm really passionate about women's basketball and making sure they have rooms to talk amongst each other, and that's what UCA has helped coordinate, is making sure behind the scenes athletes, women's basketball players can have those discussions and lay the foundation for a PA and a union eventually.
I don't really have a lot to add. I think that my fellow panelists have hit on the things that I'd like to talk about. I think the obvious answer to the question is self-policing never works, though, right? There's too much money involved, there's too much power involved, there's too much incentive to get the competitive advantage for your organization. So I'll go back to what I said earlier. Athletes involved in governance decisions and putting people that have a stake in the decisions, in the rooms where the decisions are being made, with power to make those decisions is incredibly important.
Yeah, I would conclude with accountability and transparency are so important right now. A lot of the numbers we don't even see. So I feel like if the universities and the NCAA and the conferences are going to move forward with this revenue sharing model, which I'm all for, the athletes obviously needing to monetize on their name, image, and likeness, but they should be willing to share those numbers with us. It should not be that complicated to show people what percentage of women are getting paid, men are getting paid, break it down by sports. So I think transparency is huge. I think you could look at something like the Equity in Athletics Disclosure Act, which has been in place since 1996, and is imperative for future student athletes, male and female, to understand what a future university, how they are allocating their money to the athletic programs. And so right now, things like compensation is something that was never contemplated by Title IX because up until the Alston decision, the athletes were never able to monetize it. So one of the fundamental issues right now is, does the payment of student athletes, does that constitute a form of financial assistance that should be covered by Title IX? I would argue it obviously should be, and I think if you look at the regulations, you have 10 great factors. The 11th one probably should be compensation, to make it very clear that when the universities directly paid the athletes, just as if you were giving athletic scholarships, those need to be proportional and or equivalent. And right now, we're really just sidestepping that. So I think accountability, transparency, and I think we have great laws. I mean, Title IX is right there. It's been there for 50 years. The issue is the enforceability of it. And if we wanted to solve this problem, if the universities thought there was a chance that they were going to lose their federal funding if they were not in compliance with Title IX, right now we have 93% of the Division I programs are not in compliance with Title IX. That means they are taking federal funds and using them in a manner that is discriminatory, that is completely contrary to the legislative intent of what Congress intended when they enacted this legislation. So the easiest solution is the enforceability of Title IX. The law is there, And the ultimate threat is to remove the federal funding from the universities, which to date has never happened. Alternatively, we just leave it to the poor student athletes to have to try to step up against the universities themselves, which is just a Herculean effort, and one that I think we all would agree is just not realistic in terms of enforceability going forward.
Well, we are all for you when we want to both fully fund, but then actually fully staff. Because it's not enough to send the funding over. We need to make sure it's staffed. And I think that the issues that we've talked about today, I mean, the SCORE Act was pulled down because there was bipartisan support for taking it down, right? There were recognition that there were problems. And I think that that's the kind of thing. Equal pay for equal work, as DWC says that all the time, and it should apply everywhere. Whether you're on the factory floor or you're in the basketball court, right? It needs to apply across the board. We are running out of time. I want to make sure that everybody knows. It's my job to say, follow the Democratic Women's Caucus. We love taking up issues like this and in a wide variety of issues. We can. We'll leave some of our little cards. We are storytellers and story makers because we want to hear the stories that you have all brought today that say, that's what it looks like, right? You're the faces of the people fighting for it, of the people playing. I'm thinking about you as this amazing union organizer, but it's like, oh, she was the keeper. Right. Okay, I'm going to end on one last thing. So tell me, who was the first woman athlete that you saw and you went like, oh my God?
Billie Jean King.
Sue Bird.
I'll say Megan Rapinoe. I watched her play in college. My college.
Good answer.
Well, I also played tennis, so it was Billie Jean King, but I'm going to put Martina Navratilova and Chris Evert in there as well.
Tennis players. I want to thank you so much for helping explain and helping us understand. It's not that complex of an issue, equal pay for equal work. And indeed, as one of you said, those athletes are doing some incredible, inspiring work, and it takes us all the way from the little kids to the Olympics and Paralympics. Thank you very much to our panelists.
Okay, I'm going to keep things moving, so don't worry. Go up and get something to eat or a drink. Just want to thank our second panel and our moderator for such an engaging and thoughtful conversation. They definitely laid bare the real risks that women in Olympic sports are facing in this moment, and just as importantly, the real choices that Congress has in front of it. As a mom of two girls, I think a lot about the strength of Title IX for them, making sure that it will be there. And I think so many of us in this room can just acknowledge that the growth of sports is correlated and absolutely fueled by the growth of women's sports. And with that, I want to pivot to our next conversation. And this is a little different from the panel. This is a one-on-one fireside chat, no fire. You're going to have to bring some fire. With a lawmaker who has been deeply engaged on some of the most pressing policy questions emerging out of college athletics. I'm grateful to be joined by my colleague and my now friend, Congressman Michael Baumgartner. He represents Washington's 5th District and is serving in his first term in the U.S. House. Congressman Baumgartner was raised in Colton and Pullman, Washington. He earned his undergrad degree in economics from Washington State University and a master's degree in public administration from Harvard. Before coming to Congress, he served as a Washington State Senator, Spokane County Treasurer, and as a U.S. diplomat in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Here in the House, he serves on the Education and Workforce Committee and is the chair of the Bipartisan College Sports Caucus. In that role, he has been a leading voice on college athletics reform and has authored multiple pieces of legislation, including the Restore College Sports Act and the PROTECT Act, which would prohibit private equity firms from taking control of college athletics. During consideration of the SCORE Act, Congressman Baumgartner raised serious concerns about several of the bill's provisions and worked across the aisle to try to improve it. He even testified alongside me in the House Rules Committee, where he offered amendments aimed at addressing some of the most problematic aspects of the legislation. Now, while those amendments were ultimately rejected, the effort itself was proof that there is a genuine bipartisan interest in finding a better path forward and getting this right for college athletes. So I'm grateful that he's here. I'm grateful for his leadership, his willingness to engage constructively, and for taking the time to be with all of you. Moderating this conversation is Steve Berkowitz, one of the most respected journalists covering college sports and athletics finance. Steve most recently spent more than 2 decades at USA Today, where he covered college sports and led major data-driven reporting projects on university finances and athletic department spending. Prior to that, he worked at the Washington Post, serving in roles ranging from reporter to assistant sports editor with beats that included colleges, the Baltimore Orioles, and the 1994 Men's World Cup. Steve is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and his reporting has helped bring transparency and clarity to some of the most complex and consequential issues in college athletics. I am looking forward to this conversation and the perspective that it will bring to the broader discussion that we're having today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thanks. That's some of the nicest stuff that anybody has ever said about me professionally. First of all, I just want to point out, normally I'm not the one who's overdressed, and I feel like I've really dropped the ball here. A longtime sports editor at the Washington Post, George Solomon, who hired me, used to always talk about the need to go with new news over old news. And I had spent quite a bit of time preparing a series of really penetrating questions. And then I woke up this morning and discovered 2 new things that had occurred. So I had to sideswipe all of that and get to a couple of new things that have occurred just today. Congressman and Representative Haley Stevens sent a letter to Charlie Baker seeking information about private equity efforts in college sports. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about that a bit, and then I want to ask you a question about that.
Thank you. And I don't know if I need the microphone or I can just project loud enough. Oh, here it is. Well, let me just start by saying what an honor it is for me to be here, and big shout out to Congresswoman Trahan. She's a real rock star up here on the Hill, and I've really enjoyed getting to know her and work on college sports issues. I came as my first year of being in Congress, but sports is not a new issue to me from a legislative standpoint. I spent 8 years in the Washington State Senate, and kind of unusual for a Republican. We actually had the majority in Washington State for 6 of the 8 years I was there. And I was the vice chair of the Ways and Means Committee and then became the chair of the Commerce and Labor Committee. When the Democrats have it, it's Labor and Commerce. Republicans have it, it's Commerce and Labor. But we actually reframed it into the Commerce, Labor, and Sports Committee. So we dealt with a number of issues. And I have a strong interest in higher education growing up in Pullman, Washington, and then spent a year with the Jesuits in Mozambique, where I coached women's basketball in Mozambique. And then I had a strong friendship with college football coach Mike Leach. We taught a course together called Insurgent Warfare Football Strategy. So this is not a new subject, and I actually campaigned on this issue in my campaign, so one of the reasons that I got here. But I'm someone that strongly believes that if there's more money than there's ever been in college sports, there ought to be more opportunities for America's sons and daughters to participate. And I'm very concerned about the trajectory that we're going towards less opportunities. And to get your question about the private equity, I just see this as really endangering the traditional value of college athletics and really putting maybe the teams and the conferences and the schools on a non-reversible trajectory towards a second NFL. And we got one NFL, we don't need two. And so I have spoken out on this issue, including this letter, and I've been ironically also working with Senator Maria Cantwell. I think it's good bipartisanship. Ironically, I was a Republican candidate for U.S. Senate back in 2012, lost to Maria Cantwell, but we have a good relationship and have been working on this issue. And I just think when we wrote the first bill to ban it, we were very concerned. We were hearing rumors about private equity, and once that money gets locked away, and then just on a whim, kind of our instinct, we also put a prohibition on foreign sovereign wealth funds. Well, guess what? Those were actually active. And what was really frustrating about that issue as well, too, is while some of these large conferences were up here pushing the SCORE Act, they weren't telling any of the key decision makers in that they had private equity plans on the side. So that's a lot of hubris, I would say, and not exactly what you would like to see from these people that are supposed to be leaders in student athletics. And so, bottom line on the letter is, if you want to act like a private equity, you better get ready to be treated like one by your Congress and your IRS, is my view, and was happy to work with Representative Stevens on that letter.
You coasted through real you went through real fast that you would your idea on private equity and prohibiting private equity. Just to clarify for folks that you had introduced legislation very early on to ban those kinds of arrangements in college sports.
Yeah.
Why did you feel the need to do this and to have this be at a federal level?
And so, again, I look at this, I would describe myself as a conservative Republican. And, when I was chair of the Commerce Labor Committee, I sponsored and held the only right to work hearing, I think, in our state's history. So in the free market, I'm all about as much competition as you can get. But college athletics is not the free market. It is a highly subsidized public good, and it should be regulated like one. And if you look at the social benefit what are the problems we're trying to solve? What are the issues that we're trying to solve? When I look at college athletics, there's a traditional benefit of just student athletes and access. We understand those things. There's an economic benefit to communities like Corvallis, Oregon, or Pullman, Washington, or college communities all across the state, or all across the country. There also is a benefit to social cohesion and increasingly partisan America, where everything is red on blue or blue on red when it comes to politics, and what high school and college sports provide is a reason to put down your Democrat or your Republican moniker and just be a fan on those issues. And then if you look at what's we've seen in the benefit to young ladies with Title IX and that access and what it's done for social goods like academic progress and mental health and drug use and teen pregnancy and all these things. And you look at where kids are struggling going to college now, including young males that are having mental health problems. So we just need more access to college sports. And so with all of these issues, what I just see from the private equity, it's not that I'm against private equity. I don't mind private investment just as it's not by definition a bad, but what happens is it's a coercive influence to college athletics. And because of the pressures of football, and the strange model of college athletics that big-time football has to make enough money to fund everything else, that is the coercive mechanism that will be irreversible, I think, if it's allowed to happen and close off some of the other things we need to do. So, I think what I want to see is all athletes are treated equally, revenues distributed across the system, and that there are caps on the non-social good aspects of like exuberant college coaches' salaries. And the reason for that is, again, what are we trying to solve for? Well, I want more sporting activities. But I can go a lot deeper, I guess, in my views on this, and maybe I should just let you ask more questions. But just fundamentally, what fans and players want is this is a zero-sum game. So they want competitive balance across the system. And you can get competitive balance at various levels. You don't need $15 million coaches to get competitive balance. And I remind folks, we put in my salary cap issue, a four-star U.S. military general gets $225,000. Even though a four-star military general is a lot more important to the country than a college football coach or college basketball coach. And if you can free up that money, distribute it equally, then you have more opportunities for lacrosse and swimming and volleyball and whatever sports they want to be. I mean, it might be pickleball and flag football for all we know what comes next. But that's the value of college athletics. And what's a challenge up here is coming into New Year. I didn't know there was going to be the degree of highly paid lobbying on this issue that was a real issue for folks. I mean, it's a free country that's expression of free speech in its own way. So I get that. But I thought maybe there would just be more of a base sense of what is good about college athletics that maybe I think has been distracted from a little bit. So anyway, that's a long, winding way to say why I don't think private equity should be involved in it. Certainly, again, it just frustrates me so much. I think it explains some of the failings of SCORE to have the same guys up here pushing the SCORE Act, not accepting amendments, not working the process. And my problem with SCORE is I think it's really good for it's written for the big guys at the expense of the little guys. I care much more about the little guys. But to lobby that bill and not tell people at the same time, trying to push that you got a private equity deal getting cooked up over here, I think that's ridiculous.
Do you expect or do you anticipate or plan to ask them the same questions of the University of Utah, the Big 12, the Big 10, some of the folks who you cite in the letter to the NCAA? Do you plan to ask them the same questions of those schools and the conferences?
We do. There are other members of Congress that are on the Ways and Means Committee that are asking some of those questions right now. I did have a rep. So it's not that I'm not against private equity in general. So when the announcement got out about Utah, I tweeted about it, and it got a lot of focus. I think there was online sports Twitter may have been some BYU fans and others, not like the Utah stuff. But in any event, there was a representative who up here who is close to the University of Utah and said he got a call from their president and told me and just said, it's like, all right, that'll be all right. And then it's funny that same member wants to work with me on the sovereign wealth ban, but this private equity thing might be good for my university. And that's the other challenge up here, is that sometimes legislators, first, there's fans first instead of thinking about the policy, and then they also have donors or important people to them that have importance to the universities, and so it gets filled up. I said, guys, what are the policies we're trying to solve for? It should be access, in academic purpose and these things. But I mean, call me old-fashioned. I guess the whole thing one of the reasons I came in here is why this issue, why I campaigned on it, was because I saw what happened with the breakup of the Pac-12, and the idea that you would send a volleyball player on a school night transcontinental across the country for a conference game, I think is absurd and ludicrous. I think anybody that thinks it's all right for school, like the Californias and the Atlantic Coast Conference, I mean, what are we even talking about with these issues? So it ought to be regional in these issues. And so, I came here and I campaigned on this issue. And actually, and I'm sure Jim wouldn't mind me telling the story. I'd never met Jim Jordan. And Jim has an interest in Olympic sports, being a wrestler. And so Jim called me after my primary and said, hey, and we're just kind of checking in. And I said, hey, by the way, one of the things I'm interested in doing is trying to restore college sports. And I thought at first, Jim was kind of engaged, and I thought first he was just kind of shining me on about it. But then he called back, and then he called again. And then a staff member said, well, we have this antitrust subcommittee, and antitrust is an important piece of that. And so I've enjoyed our conversations with Jim. Jim is Jim's committee chair, and obviously antitrust could be an important piece of this thing in terms of how, depending on how it's constructed, the rest of it. And so, Jim did support SCORE and wants to get a vehicle out, and is now trying to look at, what's next. But I think he generally has a good understanding, or at least a concern about the Olympic sports athlete, because that's the other part of this thing too, is the competitive pressures of football will cascade upon themselves because upper campus that's going to engage in this has to have a winning football team. And we saw at Washington State University, we had $30 million taken out of our budget with the breakup of the Pac-12, which was a huge chunk of change. And this is a program, in football, WSU was in the top 10 5 times in the last 25 years, and it was a have-not school. But when they had a chance, they could compete. and then to have that ripped away, that money come out. And as a consequence, we just lost our track and field, our field program from track and field. So now I've got high school graduates that have less of a chance to compete in an important Olympic sport. So that's the real consequences of this thing. And when ESPN and Fox Sports are covering this issue, they cover it like they're covering the NFL. And they think that the be-all, end-all is the football playoffs and the same kind of sports ecosystem, and that is not the norm. That is not what we should be governed for. Anyway, obviously I can speak a lot about these things. I'll keep my answers a little shorter here going forward. So.
Let me, since you touched on this in terms of the coach's compensation, the football coach at Indiana, Kurt Cignetti, has already guaranteed himself $2.3 million in bonuses. If they win the championship game on Monday night, he would get another $1 million. So he would get $3.3 million in bonuses alone. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, in a free market sense, he's worth it. I mean, he's a tremendous coach. Mike Leach, who was, Mike and I went to 10 countries together. We taught this class. We probably talked 3 times a week on the phone. Mike was one of the most innovative, and Mike was worth it. But again, David Petraeus was worth more than $225,000 when he was a 4-star general in Baghdad. A nuclear engineer that we have that's managing our weapons system is worth a lot in the market. I'm just arguing that this is not a free market in terms of what's saying. And so, what would happen if we put a salary cap? And where I think if the athletes are going to have to give, and on the athlete's standpoint, with all due respect, we can't have a free market. I don't believe in a free market on the athletic in the sense of winner take all on the athlete side. Shedeur Sanders and Arch Manning and Livy Dune, the people that are doing the very best out of NIL, should not be what is the primary driving factor for athletes. It should be increasing opportunities for athletes, making sure Olympics and women's sports are there in those men's sports that are less suited. So that's what I want us to govern for, the problem I want us to solve. But if you look at the thing why the college sports thing I think will come out is the presidents and the conferences actually secretly would love the coaches cap because they can't govern themselves. There are now over $1 billion in salary obligations for buyouts at the Power 4 level. And so, there's just not a huge constituency of coaches. And as a fan, we enjoyed it just as much when Nick Saban was making, $300,000 as $500. The fans don't care; they just want to win. On that standpoint. So, and what would happen if you put a salary cap on the coaches? I think Cignetti would go to the NFL. Well, God bless him, for doing that. But there's a ton of young people that would like to get into coaching and can have a competitive environment. So there's no loss of public good there. College football isn't more enjoyable when a college coach is making all this money. And so where can the money come from? I've gotten to know Cody Campbell a little bit through this system. I'm sure you all know Cody, and I wouldn't speak for him. I like Cody. He played football for Leach, and so we have that connection. Cody's idea is that if you rework the Broadcasting Act, that you can bring more money into the system, essentially hold the big conferences whole, and then pepper that money throughout the smaller schools to try to restore some of this balance. But I think if you look at the college coaches' salaries and then how big some of these staffs are, and does the linebacker coach need an assistant linebacker coach, need a scout? The staffs are humongous now because of this pressure on football. You could get a lot of money out of that to help other sports, and you could open up opportunities. And God bless Kirk Cignetti. I think he's amazing. But I'm not here to the extent that I can as one member of Congress to write rules for college sports for the benefit of Nick Saban and Kirk Cignetti.
Do you think that there should be caps on other people who work in higher ed? There are college presidents. There are financial managers who are making 7-figure salaries as well. That if you applied the same thing that you had talked about in your legislation at 10 times cost of attendance, that those salaries would be way over that number as well.
That's a broader conversation. So, in general, in higher ed, I think if you look at the data, the fact that the federal government have made loans so available, they have inflated this is upper campus. They have inflated the price of inflation, brought on a lot of deans and all this administrators, and it's just come straight. It's almost a one-for-one basis. The more money the federal government makes available in loans. When I was in the state legislature, we did something that, and when it's Republicans to control the legislature, I said, guys, we got to do something to higher ed. We can't beat the Democrats in the K through 12 spending war just because they're closer with the teachers union and everything. And so I said, but what we can do in higher ed, we can do for pennies on the dollar compared to K through 12. And so we actually did a 20% reduction by mandate in Washington State, in the state of Washington on college tuition. And then we tied it to to inflation plus population growth on the inflator going forward. And it was good policy, and I think this is a longer conversation. What is the right price for college? The right price for college is a price that no one has to go in debt. You ought to be able to work a part-time job and get a summer job, and that's how you should go through college, like is price. And so that's how this is undergraduate education. So you should scale undergraduate education to that. That's a large. I taught at there's a university, the most elite university in France is called Sciences Po. So I was an adjunct faculty at Sciences Po while I was in the state senate. We were a part-time state legislature. I went and talked to Sciences Po. And so what's interesting, what would be like the Harvard of France, there's not one public high school in Spokane, Washington, that isn't 3 times as nice as the nicest university in France. Just the physical. We spend so much money on our buildings and what they look like. Also, at the Harvard of France, there's not 15 different deans for all your feelings and aches and pains. There's not a diversity dean. There's not a mental health dean. All these things that might be good, but they cost money. And so there's a lot of fat you can cut out of higher education and get back to the basics on that. So that would be on higher ed in general. What I would do is remove some of the federal loans to try to get them back to basics. But But the price control issue on the athletic side, I just believe is fundamentally different, because if we don't do it, we are cascading. We are so close to club sports. I mean, we're so close to these guys, and maybe there's SEC stories today, where they're saying, hey, if Congress can't get its act together, we're going to get those lawsuits, are going to split off and just form its own. So it'll be, a private football club with some association with the university, and that'll bring a different, interesting challenges. The public interest, as the previous panel spoke about, was these are all highly subsidized public goods with a ton of public tax dollars going into upper campus, and that's why we have a say. They can go and be the Hillsdale model. That's a conservative college in Michigan that doesn't take any federal funds, and they basically can do whatever they want. But as long as our tax dollars are paying for it, then yeah, we should have a say.
The other new thing that happened today was that federal prosecutors announced charges against 20 people in connection with allegations that involved manipulating the outcome of college basketball games. You've introduced a bill that would ban prop bets on college sports. Where do you see a congressional role here, and what do you make of all of this?
I think we have a growing issue of that Congress is eventually going to have to look at of gambling on college campuses with the advent of fantasy and everybody having a casino in their pocket. What my bill does is, so what a prop bet is a bet like an individual action, like LeBron James is going to have 5 3-pointers tonight. And what happens on college campuses, these prop bets, one, there's the what they do to impact the outcome of the game, with people throwing games or doing different things there. But then just college athletes are subjected to a lot of torment and harassment from other students on campus. And so I tried to make my bill narrow, but there's some strong gambling interests up here on Capitol Hill. And and that would have, I'm not on that committee. One of the things you learn when you're a freshman in college, it's really dominated by committee chairs and committee staff, and then the lobbyist community that works with them. One thing, I made this argument I had this discussion with Mike Johnson, and he's got a lot of things on his plate, as you might imagine. But I really think there should be a college sports select committee or special committee or something on these issues, because the SCORE Act, for example, is in 3 committees of jurisdiction. So you got energy and commerce, you got education, workforce, and then judiciary. And so it's hard to have a cohesive discussion within that. And the guy we have actually that could help on a lot of these things right now, and I know that sometimes people have a tough time compartmentalizing this, but President Trump has I think, much more traditional view of college athletics, where I firmly believe, based on, I've never talked to him directly about this issue, but I know Cody Campbell has and others have. I actually think that this is not a red or blue issue where you could have a potential model. And what I tell the White House, remind them is that 100 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt helped save college football up here when it was dangerous and was going to be banned, and they kind of had this cohesive come-together moment of Congress. And I think there's an opportunity with the president on that issue, too. It would be facilitated, I think, if we had a select committee, but one of the strange things about Congress is once committees get jurisdiction and power, they don't seem to be welcoming to let it up. So who knows what comes next on that.
Well, let me ask a follow-up to that then, and I have to give a nod to Matt Brown for having raised this question yesterday at the NCAA convention during a session involving the Knight Commission. If Congress doesn't act on college sports, what do you see the chances are of President Trump just dealing with this through executive order or attempting to do it that way?
Well, it'd be interesting if something comes. I mean, he's going to be at the college football national championship. I've argued that there's political currency for both Republicans and Democrats on this issue because it's not everybody. I mean, there's a lot of people back home think college sports is nuts and this sort of stuff. But at least in my campaign, people were interested in it. It allowed me to attract some Democrats and some moderates. I think it would allow, and vice versa on those issues. What I see in the tea leaves now, I think those people that are really strongly on the player advocacy side, which I would consider myself too, I just want the player advocates to think about not just getting high paychecks for people. The goal is not the left tackle at Notre Dame getting as much money as he can. The goal is money across the system to increase sports. That's not what I would argue. But I think some of the online commentary is from sports writers is, look, if it gets so bad here, the universities will cry uncle and come back and want to do collective bargaining on things. And I'm not knee-jerk out against that because we have, examples that Congress allows in pro sports to have leagues where people kind of get it. Yeah, why? Pro sports are not a free market. You have salary caps, you have drafts, you have all these things that in the name of competitive balance. But I think what would be better, for the players' advocates to really think about how do you govern this issue. And so maybe a narrower discussion of the antitrust than is had. I think the House settlement is flawed. And so to wrap this thing around the House settlement is a mistake. And so we'll just have to see what comes next. But from what comes to the president, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, he certainly has issued quite a few executive orders.
Well, in that vein, I mean, he issued an executive order in July that required a number of cabinet-level officials to have certain things happen, and you publicly supported him when he issued that. Are you aware of where any of that stands in terms of what was supposed to have been done under that order? I'm
not. I just talked to our legislative folks, and one thing I'd say about internal, baseball. If those of you are in this room, you probably follow Congress closely enough to know that it was a priority. It was a surprise when SCORE didn't get to the floor because it had been prioritized that week. It fell short. I had voted for the rule, which is to boost it, to give it the chance to get to the floor because you're trying to play team ball in the rule. And then I just told my guys, I'm like, guys, you knew about this issue. I campaigned on it. I've been very transparent on this issue. I've tried to offer amendments. So I was trying to do it within the team. But no, I'm not going to support the bill right now. And so there's other people that I'm not going to say I was responsible for that. I'll just speak for myself. I did have some people talk to me. I think the people I'm talking to at the White House, they're working with our leadership on the Republican side on a number of issues. And so until SCORE, they may try to re-up SCORE or take a different, there's still a lobbying effort that I was, hearing about on this issue. It's interesting, I don't get a lot of these lobbyists coming to my office. But so what will the president do? We'll see. Obviously we're all going to see that. Again, if you could pause for a second. One of the things in the last summer, when this thing was getting pushed in SCORE, I told the people I was around, I said, guys, you need one more football season of angst. And just quite frankly, we got a lot of members of our conference that are from the South. And actually to get a deal done, having the SEC be challenged a little bit actually helps because those members goes, hey, maybe this system isn't working. And, they're very regional. I wouldn't say everybody from the SEC thinks we play real football in the West Coast. There's some of that kind of provincial nature. So I think it's a great opportunity. I really think this spring and going into the summer, you really could hammer out a real deal because of some of the fissures, because score came up low. And I think Senator Cantwell from that side, is looking for some interesting solutions as well too. And that's one of the nice things is I get to know Lori and the people in this room.
To wrap this up, can you provide, to follow up again on what you just said, can you provide an assessment of what you think the chances are of a bill clearing either chamber during the remainder of this session before you get into the midterms?
I think I wouldn't be surprised on the Republican side if there was instead of focusing on codifying House, I wouldn't be surprised if there was this discussion. Could you have a discussion about limited antitrust and what would that do? So you didn't close off the chance to player unions and other things. And so could that be a piece of the deal? I think I personally believe really strongly in this private equity thing, and I think there's a political win there. So I'll try to inject some of those things, but some of that is just going to have to be by the stakeholders that are involved because, look, I mean, the Big Ten and the Big Ten commissioner and the SEC and the SEC commissioner were driving the train on this thing. So do they want to come to the table and work as like a team with other people? Have they counted their votes yet? None of this stuff. And this is where Senator Cantwell and I talk about, I think she'll be comfortably saying, well, no, we wrote a letter together. She's afraid. She says it was just a power grab with SCORE. And so do they want to come to the table and have, I think, a more realistic discussion with other folks? But again, what are we trying to solve for? It's more opportunities on college campuses for America's sons and daughters to compete. And if we keep that as the guiding post, then you'll get good policy to follow. And I think it's just good to articulate that and drive towards that. Anybody that can show me a piece of legislation that logically leads to more, not less, opportunities on a college campus for sporting activities, I'll vote for that piece of legislation.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Big shout out to Congresswoman Trahan for doing this.
Okay, as they're leaving, let's thank Congressman Baumgartner and Steve Berkowitz for a thoughtful and candid discussion about the state of play. Well, one more time. And I have to say, that was the hardest time during this summit for me to embrace my role as convener rather than just jump up on stage and get involved in that conversation. We're going to turn to our third and final panel of the day. It's titled The State of NIL from the College Sports Commission to Revenue Sharing. Few aspects of college athletics today are as consequential as the NIL landscape. State NIL laws continue to proliferate, each with different standards, definitions, and enforcement mechanisms. The result is a patchwork that some argue disadvantages athletes, complicates compliance for institutions, and invites constant legal uncertainty. Others argue it's the natural progression of a new marketplace that was set to burst at the seams before finally being unleashed after the Supreme Court's Alston decision and subsequent change to NCAA rules. At the same time, the College Sports Commission is scaling up its enforcement efforts with a particular focus on collectives, while revenue sharing agreements between schools and athletes increasingly include provisions that appear to place significant restrictions on athletes' rights and earning potential. Layered on top of that is a largely unregulated market for college sports agents, although that may change with this new FTC inquiry, but leaving many athletes vulnerable to exploitative representation at a moment when they are the first gaining access to meaningful compensation. So this panel will explore what a workable national NIL framework could and should look like. Should a federal standard fully preempt state laws, or should it establish a federal floor while allowing room for state variation? How should Congress balance athlete empowerment with concerns raised by the NCAA conferences and schools about competitive balance, pay to play, and so-called vice industries? And what enforcement mechanisms, whether through the College Sports Commission, the NCAA, government agencies, or another body entirely, would actually work in practice? We are fortunate to have another excellent group to tackle these questions, beginning with our moderator. Let's welcome back Gabe Feldman, who may have to add professional panel moderator to his already long list of titles. As I noted earlier, Gabe is one of the country's leading experts on sports law and governance, and we're grateful to have him guiding this conversation as well. And joining Gabe are four panelists, with deeply complementary perspectives. Sam Ehrlich is an assistant professor of legal studies at Boise State University. His research focuses on the legal governance of sports, including athlete employment rights, antitrust exemptions, and the liability frameworks that shape how athletic organizations operate. Darren Heitner is the founder and managing partner of Heitner Legal and one of the most influential voices in the NIL space. He played a pivotal role in drafting Florida State's first-in-the-nation NIL law, which helped catalyze NIL legislation nationwide, and he represents some of the most prominent athletes in the country today. Hunter Bador is chairman and co-founder of the Collective Association and president and co-founder of Spire Sports Group and the Volunteer Club. A University of Tennessee alumnus, he has been at the center of the collective model and brings real-world insight into how NIL functions on the ground for athletes and for institutions. And finally, Nick Levy is a football player at the University of Wisconsin and a member of athletes.org. Nick brings the athlete perspective to this discussion, grounding the policy debate in lived experience and reminding us who these systems are meant to serve. This panel will help close out today's summit by grappling with one of the most urgent and complex issues in college athletics. Thanks for hanging in there today. And Gabe, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you again, Congresswoman, for putting all this together. It's been a great day so far, and I'm excited to wrap things up with this group of panelists. And before we get into how to potentially solve the problem of this chaotic landscape, I think it would be helpful to better understand what the landscape looks like from the ground. And so, Sam, I'm going to start with you to just give us an overview, and then Darren, I'll shift over to you to talk about some of the specifics, and then we can go down the line. But for those of you who don't know, Sam has a website called the College Athlete Litigation Tracker.
It's called Sports Litigation Tracker.
Sports Litigation Tracker, which is an incredible resource. So thank you, Sam, for making that available for all of us. You have been tracking the developments in the college litigation landscape more than anybody. Can you just give us a little bit of the lay of the land to help set up the parameters of the problem we're trying to solve?
Well, I'll try, Gabe, but we only have 45 minutes, so I don't know how much I'll be able to do. But I think in general, really, and again, I want to echo everyone by saying thank you to Congressman Trahan and Dylan and Francis for inviting me here. I'm absolutely pleased to be here on this really great panel, and seeing the other panels are amazing as well. And I think really the key thing that has led to kind of all these questions about college sports and about how college sports is going to operate moving forward is really, in Congresswoman Trahan's introduction, she hit the nail on the head. It's the Alston decision, and the Alston decision really changing the game, taking away that kind of quasi-exemption that we saw with the Board of Regents decision back in 1984, and really kind of declaring in some ways open season on the NCAA for a lot of these anti-competitive practices that athletes have been challenging and really not being very successful on before Alston, but now they very clearly are. And even beyond athletes, we had the state of Ohio decision and the state of Tennessee decisions that opened the transfer portal, kind of eliminated the earned residence rule that was required before, and it allows for athletes to negotiate NIL compensation prior to enrollment at a particular school, which the NCAA had said no to. And now we have all these eligibility rules decisions, 4 dozen of them at this point, not decisions but lawsuits that have challenged the idea that the NCAA can restrict athletes to a certain amount of time operating as a college athlete, especially now that they are getting paid. And of course, this is all framed by the House settlement, which has of course been a tenor of all these conversations, that have led to direct payments between universities to college athletes through revenue sharing models, all this back pay stuff as well as the establishment of the College Sports Commission, which is intended to kind of govern third-party NIL. And one thing, the College Sports Commission, that's kind of the big looming question right now. And I know there's been a lot of conversations about this, both online, in a variety of articles. Ross Dellinger's been writing a lot about this in the past few days, about maybe the College Sports Commission is starting to ramp up on actually trying to enforce, certain components of the House settlement and kind of their regulations of third-party NIL, and trying to kind of tamp down on what they see as, cap circumvention. And it'll be really interesting to see how that all plays out within the next few years.
Great, thanks, Sam. Darren, as someone who has been involved in this space since day one, has probably negotiated and seen and been actively involved in more deals than anybody else in the country. And I just want to side note, when I was a baby law professor and had much darker hair, one of the first panels I got invited to was by a very eager law student at the University of Florida named Darren Heitner. So it is fun to come back sort of full circle now as your sort of proud uncle. But tell us from your perspective in dealing with the athletes and the families, and Hunter will get your perspective on this as well, but what these deals look like and what are some of the issues that are raised by not only the deals, but the rules or the outline of the rules that the athletes are dealing in.
Well, it's great to see you, dear uncle, and thank you to the Congresswoman and her staff for inviting me here today. I guess the way to describe it from my perspective is right now the system, it's a lucrative nightmare. We've heard from the executive director of the NFLPA before, people on behalf of athletes.org. We've heard about potential for collective bargaining, unionization, and employee status. The biggest differentiation between the professional ranks and the college space right now is a lack of uniformity. At the professional level, you have uniform player contracts. At the college level and even at the high school level, you have these revenue sharing agreements. And I heard someone earlier say, often you can write anything you want as the title of legislation, but what matters is what's within them. Take a look at some of these revenue sharing agreements, which oftentimes are titled NIL license agreements. They oftentimes go out of their way to state within those contracts that it is not pay for play. In fact, the new version of the Big Ten template goes as far to say that they're not even service contracts. They're supposed to be license agreements. But then you look within the documents themselves and you see that payments are backloaded so that they actually coincide with the season in which the player is performing. They try to hold back making payments to players if the player then enters into the transfer portal after the season as a mechanism to try to restrain their ability to move place to place. There's morals clauses within them. And the termination language is oftentimes at the sole discretion of the universities. I mean, there's very little. I've represented probably, let's say, 40 athletes in this cycle alone for the college football space. Think about how many athletes do not have counsel and are just signing whatever document is put in front of them. It's very, very scary. In fact, there's even language in the Big Ten template, and most of the Big Ten schools are using this, but variations therefrom, that effectively says an athlete is waiving his or her right to bring a legal challenge to say that he or she is an employee. That's how scared that they are. And talking about the College Sports Commission, the CSC, there's no privity in these contracts. The CSC is not a party, yet somehow the athlete is waiving any rights to go against the CSC and has a reporting obligation to the CSC for contracts that don't even have to do with the NIL licensing agreement. I'm just talking about the Big Ten right there. Get outside of the Big Ten, there's no uniformity. Every single other conference, whether you're looking at the SEC, the ACC, etc., every school is using a different document. Oftentimes, it's in size 10 font, and we're talking about 20 to 30 pages in length. Do you really think that an athlete has the capacity to read, understand, review, and analyze, and negotiate that document against legal counsel, general counsel for the universities? I just touched on the license agreement. I'll be quick on the others. That's just one agreement. You still have collectives that are providing agreements to students. That also varies school to school. The new iteration is the Multimedia Rights Agreement, an MMR agreement that you see from the likes of Learfield, Playfly, etc. The challenge here is that athletes are being told, you're going to get that money. But those agreements, if you want to call them agreements, they're just letters of interest. It says the athlete's going to receive approximately a certain amount of money, and it's not a guarantee whatsoever. So the athletes are being told one thing, but when you look within the fine print, they're actually being told there's no guarantee whatsoever. And the CSC recently came out and said those agreements, even though they're not specific, have to be disclosed. And oh, by the way, we think that they're violative of our rules and regulations. I also heard a comment earlier that the CSC is independent. It's funded by the power conferences, the NCAA, and the schools. There's no independence whatsoever. Finally, and I don't want to hog the floor here, there's also agent representation agreements, which we're constantly negotiating, and I know that's of concern to the Congresswoman. Sometimes we're seeing commissions upwards of 30%, which is very high in my estimation, particularly for these specific NIL license agreements that are effectively employment agreements, but wink, wink, they're not. At the professional level, if you're looking at the NFLPA, they regulate commissions at 3% max. The NBPA, the National Basketball Players Association, regulates it at 4% max. And then there's a lot of issues within these rep agreements themselves. I've been in situations where there's no capacity for the player to actually terminate those agreements unless there's a breach. No. These are the types of agreements that should be able to be terminated for convenience, just as is the case at the professional level. And I'll end on this. At the professional level, you also have standard representation agreements. And so there's standardization when you have these forces at play. There is absolutely no uniformity right now at the college level, and it is creating a mess.
Thanks, Darren, and it's clear you had some very good mentors as a law student. But let me, Hunter, let me go to you from the collective perspective. Tell me, I mean, Darren just laid out a lot, and Sam has laid out a lot, but what do people not quite understand about this world and what these agreements look like, and how difficult it is to navigate this world?
Yeah, well, first of all, again, Congresswoman, thank you for having us. NIL collective operators are not always asked to be at these forums, so it's nice to be included, and pleasure to share the stage with you gentlemen. Both of you guys are going to be tough to follow. I won't be that long-winded. I think that the first thing to understand is that the NCAA for the last several years has spent millions of dollars on lobbyists to convince our elected officials that college sports, in particular football, is collapsing. It is terrible for the game. Student athletes are being harmed. The sky is falling. It's all falling apart. And to me, that is just a false narrative. Are there things that need to be fixed? Absolutely, just like anything else. It's not perfect. But I would point to some things that don't get talked about as much. Number one, and most importantly, student athletes are now being compensated, as they should be. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. The players are the driving force of this. So, first and foremost, the right thing is happening on that front. The second point I would add is viewership is better than ever. So there's not this turn-off from fans and spectators that now student athletes are making money that they're wanting to tune in less. That's just a false narrative. And three, there was a thought when NIL became a thing in 2021 that the rich would get richer, so to speak, meaning the Final Four, if you will. For years it was always Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, Ohio State. You look at the Final Four this year, and you have Ole Miss, who has never been to the playoffs, not only made the playoffs, but has won a couple games and was a drive away from playing for the national championship. You have Miami. That looks like the Miami of the late 80s and 90s, obviously playing for a national championship. And then Indiana and what they've been able to do over the last 2 years just speaks for itself. And so NIL has created more parity than ever before. And so, like I said, there are some things that can be corrected. I think when people talk about, well, it's just the wild, wild west, the focus there is on the transfer portal. And I think one of the ways that you could calm the waters is if there were an athlete agent registry, just like there is in the NFL or the NBA. If you want to represent a student athlete, great, but you're going to have to pass a background check. You're going to have to register in every state that you want to recruit a student athlete. You're going to have to take a test. In the NFL, you have to have a postgraduate degree in something. Maybe that's one step too far. But the point is there's a system there that would eliminate a lot of the bad actors. And there's some agents that have gotten into the game that they just want to convince a player to go into the portal just so they can get a quick commission, a quick buck. There are some really good agents that have entered the space in large part because the money has become so great. But while they are tough negotiators, they're looking out for the long-term best interests of their clients, meaning how do I put my client in a position to ultimately reach the big goal, which is the NFL, the NBA, or the WNBA. And so I think if there were some parameters on if you want to represent a player, you have to go through a process. I think that would do a lot to calm the NIL transfer portal waters.
Great. Thank you, Hunter. And I will note in that list of schools, one you forgot to mention was the only school from the state of Louisiana that has made it to the college football playoffs, Tulane University. So roll wave.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay.
Texas Tech made it too. So.
Yeah. Nick, let me come to you, save the best for last here. And the reason why we are all here is because of the Nick Levy's of the country, and not only for what you do on the field, but for what you will become after you leave your school. And you look out in the audience, and there are so many former student athletes who are doing so many great things. And that's one of the beauties of athletic participation, is that not only prepares you to be a great athlete, it prepares you to be a great leader, a great politician of the future. And it's why we're all here, because we want to protect these opportunities and protect this thing that we love to watch and that we love to see the benefits of for the participants. So from your perspective, and I'm going to ask you sort of a two-part question that's related, but we've heard a lot about all of the challenges and the uncertainty and the lack of uniformity. What has it been like from an athlete perspective to navigate the new NIL world? Because you are one of the few athletes in the sort of think about the history of time that has had to deal with this changing landscape as it's happened. So what has it felt like? What's been most difficult to navigate? And what's it like to be given one of these rev share agreements or NIL agreements?
Yeah. So first I'd like to thank the Congresswoman for having me out, and I'm so grateful to be here and be able to speak in front of you guys. But the new world, it's challenging. When I got into college football, which was in 2022, it was a completely different landscape than it is now. And it's evolved so much in the last 4 years that it's almost unrecognizable to what it was in the backgrounds with the NIL stuff. But the biggest thing I'd say is it's confusing. A lot of the wording that's used in contracts that players and teammates have to sign is something that we don't understand. And I think it would be very helpful if there was a list of approved agents that could help us understand what we're signing and understand what we're getting ourselves into with these agreements. On top of that, it's timely. We don't have a lot of time to make decisions with some of the windows that we have. And a lot of schools force our hand to sign contracts and to sign with schools faster than maybe would be appropriate in an official decision-making process. And it's really tough because if you don't sign, someone else will. But it's super important that you understand what you're signing. And a lot of people don't really have the time to look over all of these contracts and understand that. So sometimes players, because of the timeliness and because if you don't sign something, someone else will sign things that they don't necessarily know what they're getting into. And that can raise a lot of red flags for players signing away some of their rights.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Nick. And there used to be, back in the old days, 10, 15 years ago, that the scariest thing to have was a college athlete represented by an agent. And now the scariest thing is to have a college athlete not represented by an agent because of all these issues that you guys are talking about. But now that we've, I think, laid out the problem from all different perspectives, how do we fix it? And I'll just throw it up as a jump ball. The purpose of this panel is to talk about potential federal legislation, preemption of state law, whether it's on NIL, agent regulation, some combination of them. Anybody who wants to jump in, what's the solution?
Can I just start from an athlete's perspective?
Please.
I think it would be super helpful if athletes have their voices heard. I feel like there's a lot of times that decisions are being made behind closed doors that aren't necessarily negotiated or talked about with the I'm not just speaking for me, I'm speaking for a lot of teammates that feel like we see things in the news and we see things on social media that we necessarily didn't agree with. And there's a lot of times that we feel like if our voices were heard, decisions would be made in another way. So I think that's a massive part of it.
That's great. Thank you. And again, thank you for being here to express that. And let me ask you just as follow-up on that, what was it that motivated you to want to be on this panel? Because I imagine you have a few other things you might want to be doing with your time right now. So what was it that drove you to want to do
this?
Yeah,
it is winter break, so I like being home. I mean, I love sports, particularly I love football, and I know so many people that have been impacted by sports, whether that's from high school to college to professional level. And like I said, I just feel like athletes' voices aren't heard enough in these matters. And because I love the game so much and all of them, they bring such great camaraderie, great teammates, great relationships, and they impact your life all the way down the road. They play such a big impact on all athletes' lives. So just being able to have a voice heard, and I'm just one of very many that I would like that would probably like to be up here and speak their opinion. But just because of that, that's why I'm here.
Great, thank you. And it took me a lot longer to get up here than it took you to get up here. So congratulations on me here. But who else wants to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, we shouldn't get lost in the sense that the status quo is actually wonderful if you compare it to pre-July 1, 2021. You actually do have athletes who are earning in excess of 7 figures annually, and quite a few of them. And even though there have been attempts to place constraints on the transactions, in many senses, the fair market does predominate. There will be people will find a way to pay the athletes whatever value they believe that they are bringing to the table. Not to pander necessarily to the Congresswoman, but I've been very vocal about how I'm against many pieces of legislation that have been proposed over the past few years, actually even dating back prior to July 1, 2021. I think many parts of your piece of legislation are fantastic, actually. I love I'm challenged in many ways as to how, if there is going to be collective bargaining, it occurs. What is the bargaining unit? Are there multiple bargaining units? How do you deal with the private versus public school dilemma? Who is organizing it? Are they actually employees, or is Congress going to provide some sort of special status? I mean, there are many questions, and I think the way that you attack it is we don't need to necessarily find all of the solutions right now. We can create a committee or committees to really dig into it and spend the time to figure out exactly what that looks like. And I think also, everyone pushes, or a lot of people are now pushing this concept of collective bargaining, but we have to make sure that the players even want that. Because I think you have a lot of athletic directors and coaches who are coming around to the sense that we can't have what's happening, so we're pushing towards collective bargaining, even though presidents and chancellors and conference commissioners may not agree with that. But it's all about hearing from the athletes, so we have to make sure that they're interested in that as well. From the agent perspective, one thing that you oftentimes hear agents complain about, and this predates NIL, is that every state has a different process by which you have to register. There's different state laws. In fact, if you look at California's athlete agent law versus Florida's athlete agent law, they are completely different. So having a federal standard, and even instead of having it, is there a bee in here? Instead of having it where you have to actually register and become licensed on a state-by-state basis, I've long been a critic of the FTC because you had the Sports Agent Responsibility and Trust Act with the acronym SPARTA on the books for over 20 years. Until this week, I don't think the FTC ever did anything with respect to it. So it's actually encouraging that the FTC may finally be willing to look at this space. And if the FTC is willing to take it on, perhaps instead of having separate registries state by state, you have a federal registry. And it can also help vet those agents and provide players with a better understanding of who is reputable and who may be a street agent that you can't trust. I think those are a couple of important things.
Great, thanks, Darren. And that was tremendous pandering, by the way. But just, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I think just to add on to what Darren said, a lot of really good points there. I think a lot of the big issues with college sports right now are really more kind of little questions. I think there's a lot of, there's a ton of these little questions that really do have to be answered. How can we kind of rein in kind of these rogue agents who, maybe have conflicts of interest or, have, some kind of force that's not necessarily, kind of violating fiduciary duties in a certain way, or at least, on the facially seems like they're violating fiduciary duties. We have questions about international athletes and whether they are risking their visa status by getting any kind of NIL deals. Like, a lot of these little questions do have to be answered, but personally, I just think the answer is not to give all the power to the NCAA, because there's inherent conflicts of interest there. There's major conflicts of interest there. You can't have the NCAA regulating agents. That just doesn't work, because the NCAA is the schools. They represent the schools. They're controlled by the schools, and the schools want particular things out of agents that maybe are not in the best interest of players. And I think one thing to kind of add on to Darren's discussion of Sparta, he's absolutely right. The FTC has done nothing about Sparta, and I think one big thing that shouldn't go unnoticed here, there have been calls for this for decades. Add a private right of action to Sparta. Give the athletes the power to go after agents who violate these duties. And right now there hasn't been anything. It's led Sparta to being pretty meaningless at this point. Though, of course, now we might actually get something.
Yeah, and there isn't. I think it's an irony that at the professional level, where you do have collective bargaining and unions, one significant role of the union is to regulate their agents, and they are empowered to do that under federal labor law. They're empowered to create the agents, and then can create whatever registration requirements they want. They can discipline them, and there is real accountability that's not dependent on the state or the federal government that has lots of other things. So, again, not to put a thumb on either side of the collective bargaining scale, but that is another benefit of having unionization or some quasi-union that would have the power to regulate agents in a way that's different than continuing to try to rely on states or the FTC that have proven that they're not, whether they don't have the time, they don't have the resources, they don't have the will to do it. But Hunter, let me go back to you in terms of what you think might help in terms of federal legislation and uniformity and what folks sitting in Congress might be able to do.
Yeah, I think those are all great points, and just three that I would add is one, I truly believe within the college sports ecosystem, there are a lot of smart people, a lot of smart presidents, chancellors, conference commissioners, ADs, collective operators, not necessarily myself, but there are some smart people that if people could let their personal interests, put those to the side and come together for the common good of the sport, I do think most of the issues could be solved without federal intervention. If that can't happen, I think federal intervention that provides more clarity, not control, that enhances student athletes' ability to make money, not restricts it. I don't think it makes any sense to give the NCAA antitrust exemption. So I'm not opposed to some sort of federal intervention as long as it's centered around the student athlete. And I do think the conversation about collective bargaining is definitely something that we should explore. And I can say that not from a biased perspective, because it could put collectives out of business. There's a reason there's not collectives in the NFL or NBA. And so, but just looking at all the other sports that generate revenue, there is collective bargaining. And Darren's exactly right. It's very complicated because you're not just dealing with one sport. You're dealing with men's sports, women's sports, sports that make revenue, sports that don't. So it's, and the best question is, do the student athletes even want that? And that gets into the fine print. But I do think that probably the next best step is to explore what collective bargaining would look like. Certainly have student athletes a part of that discussion so they know what they're getting into. But those would be my suggestions.
Okay, great. So picking up on that, let's assume that for one of any variety of reasons, we don't end up with collective bargaining. Because in some ways, collective bargaining solves a lot of the issues. How do we distribute the money however they decide to distribute the money? We don't look at the NFL collective bargaining agreement and say it's unfair that the players are getting X percent versus the owners. That's what they agreed to. Now, we may say they shouldn't have agreed to it, but they agree to it, and so that's binding, and you can't sue under antitrust law to try to undo it. Let's say either some piece of legislation is passed that prohibits employee classification or unionization, or nothing is passed, but the athletes decide they don't want to be in a union. And they decide they would rather do individual negotiations, they'd rather sue under antitrust law, but Congress still does want to do something to provide uniformity. How do you balance giving athletes significant and fair benefits with the pressures that might put on, as the schools would claim, the more money we give, and you might fight the premise here, but the more money we give to football and basketball players, the less money we have to spend elsewhere. So Darren's about to fight the premise. I'll let you talk about that. But before you do that, there is this idea that it is a zero-sum game, and that if we give more to one set of athletes, that means less for another set of athletes or less for education. And if you don't have a CBA to dictate that, how does Congress strike that balance?
I don't think that's Congress's role, because you cannot take these presidents and chancellors at their word. They're arguing that they can't fund women's or Olympic sports, but at the same time paying coaches in excess of $10 million a year. And at the same time spending hundreds of millions of dollars on improving their facilities. They have the money, right? They're just basically cooking the books to try to frame it in a way that makes you empathetic. Don't fall for it. Thank you.
And I would also add, if schools can come up with $60 million for buyouts for failing at your job, we should be able to take care of the Olympic sports.
Fair, but let's say, putting that issue aside, and if we want to have uniformity, but we're not going to get uniformity through collective bargaining. Collective bargaining can give us uniformity. If we don't have collective bargaining, but we do want uniformity, someone has to try to impose some sort of rules or regulation, because we know what will happen if we leave it up to the individual schools. It's the reason we have salary caps and luxury taxes in professional sports, because the teams would spend themselves to death. And in most other industries, you'd say, fine, just spend yourself to death and then may the best company win. But for those who argue we can't control ourselves because we as presidents or chancellors or athletic directors, we are forced to make irrational decisions over and over and over again. And the only way that we will stop doing this is if we are forced to collectively stop doing it. But if you don't have collective bargaining to stop it, and you then say, well, then we need Congress to step in. Darren, I agree whether you say, look, we can't create an antitrust exemption, just say schools, you get to decide. But how do we get uniformity if we don't have collective bargaining? I guess that's my question.
So I will say, and I don't know if this is actually answering your question, Gabe, but I think one point that does have to be raised is that antitrust law is not a law that says everything the NCAA does is wrong. Antitrust law says that if you look at the rule of reason, and this is after Alston especially, the idea that rule of reason is now going to be the rule of the game here. We're not going to have any kind of quasi-exemptions. We're not going to have any kind of quick look that kind of favors the NCAA in this case. You balance the pro-competitive benefits of the restraint against the anti-competitive harms. And taking eligibility, for example, I do not believe, I've read every single one of these decisions. I've read every single one of these judicial decisions. I don't think that there are any judges out there who have said, and in fact there have been a lot of judges even ruling for the players who have said the opposite, none of these judges are saying unlimited eligibility is on the table. That's not going to be a thing. That there is pro-competitive benefits to tying college sports to being a college athlete, and that in itself has natural limits. So I think allowing antitrust law, at least in certain things, to do its work, there's significant benefit to that because you do require the NCAA to be able to justify these restraints. You do, even without collective bargaining, even if you don't give the non-statutory labor exemption, there is an endpoint here, and it is the NCAA being able to conclusively justify these restraints in order to kind of attack the competitive balance issues, in order to attack we need to make sure that all of our sports are supported issues. I think there are ways to do that. It just hasn't really been done yet.
Can I pander again? Please. You preempt the states to ensure the athletes' rights and then allow the states to go above and beyond if you'd like. I think that's brilliant. And I haven't seen anyone else propose that. But that's the biggest thing. Every other bill seeks to preempt states and then take away the athletes' rights by providing a limited antitrust exemption and affirmatively classifying these athletes as not being employees, which is absolutely a judicial determination. And if Congress were to pass a piece of legislation that renders athletes not employees, you better bet there's going to be tons of litigation surrounding that. So I think that's the right method if you want to try to create some form of uniformity, is you have this base level of rights across the country, and I hope there's some inclusion about what's happening currently at the CSC, because that's very scary at the College Sports Commission level. I mean, they just came out with a report this past week that talked about how many deals had been approved and the minuscule, or you could say comparatively minuscule amount of deals that have been rejected. What they left out of that report is the number of deals that have not yet actually been determined. There are tons of deals that have been left in purgatory for months, and many athletes who aren't getting paid in the process. That's scary. And the CSC says they're actually going to be taking more remedial action coming up in the future. What is the basis for making their determinations? Fair market value, a completely subjective standard, and they don't say what actually is involved in that analysis. And secondly, whether there's a legitimate business interest. Who is the CSC to decide whether there's a legitimate business interest? Again, you could claim that they're an independent organization, but it's literally the NCAA and the conferences, particularly the Big Ten and the SEC, that are controlling it, and that's what's scary to me.
So then what do you all envision as the appropriate enforcement mechanism, and what is the oversight entity? If it's not the NCAA, it's not a quasi-independent entity that it stands up, who regulates and oversees and decides whether it's fair market value or valid business purpose? Who does it? Again, in the absence of a collective bargaining agreement. Collective bargaining, they dictate who does that. But absent that, who controls it?
I'll just be really brief. When Alex Rodriguez and Mark Lowry decide they want to buy the Minnesota Timberwolves, do they go to the CSC to determine whether it's fair market value? Like, why is there an organization that has to decide whether, if somebody wants to pay an athlete a certain amount of money, that's fair market value? And the general public, including the athlete, doesn't even learn why that decision is made. They're just told, you need to amend it to be fair market value, whatever that means, or you have to arbitrate it. You've also lost your right to litigate it. You have to arbitrate it. So I don't know why we have to have any fair market value criteria or any legitimate business purpose criteria. It's perplexing to me.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say, we're talking about solving a problem that may not be a problem, and I know that the comeback to that is, well, some schools are just going to have a competitive advantage. They're going to have more financial resources, but that's been going on for 100 years before NIL. First, it was schools that were able to pay coaches and assistants more money than everybody else. Then it became a facilities arm race, who could have the best facilities and so forth. So it's never been a level playing field. You're certainly adding a layer to it, but I don't know why there necessarily has to be a group that determines what a booster or school or company wants to compensate a player.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. So, but assume for the sake of argument that you do want a system that allows college athletes to receive some percentage of some defined category of revenue, but not be paid over that amount. So assume you want to have a quasi-salary cap. All right? Just assume that you want it. And assume that you want all the schools to operate under that same cap. And assume that you also want athletes to be able to do NIL deals, endorsement deals, just like every other student on campus and just like every pro athlete. But as we've seen in the news with the Los Angeles Clippers, allegedly. The pro leagues all have rules in place to prevent circumvention of the cap. And that is designed to make sure that those NIL deals are legitimate NIL deals. They're not ways to try to exceed the cap, because there are lots of billionaire sports team owners that would like to spend more than they're allowed to under the cap. But they have very strict rules to say, of course you can do an NIL deal, but of course it has to be a real NIL deal. Let's just say, for sake of argument, that that's what we want in college sports. But again, we can't get it through collective bargaining. In that sense, how do you ensure that the schools are complying with this cap?
Well, I think the Clippers example is a really good one because, again, this is all allegations, but there's another seat at the table in that. And I know I'm going to be going against the premise of your question here, but the NBPA is going to have something to say if Kawhi Leonard gets punished for that. There's a seat at the table to kind of push back against the NCAA's kind of determination of whether this is cap circumvention or not, and what the punishment should be, and that's important. So I think moving on and saying, okay, well, if we don't have collective bargaining, we don't have a union here that kind of fits the function of the NBPA to kind of push back against this, it needs to be something where we have a college sports commission that is truly, truly, truly independent. And as Darren said, the current CSC, even if it's being framed as independent, the fact that it's funded by the Power Four schools, the NCAA and the opted schools, it means it's financially not independent, and it goes to the whims of, to a certain extent, the House settlement, but it goes to the whims of those financial interests. But if you had a truly independent group, and maybe it's just a truly independent group that, maybe I'm just describing a players union here, but that does advocate for the players and has a legally protected voice, as we've heard on several of these panels already, a legally protected voice to be able to advocate for the players when they're being accused of signing these deals or agreeing to these deals that are, against whatever rules the CSC comes up with. That, I think, gets to what we're talking about. But again, I think I'm kind of just describing a players union here, so.
As players advocates, you wouldn't want there to be any controls to ensure that schools are spending within the cap. I found it really interesting. Today it came out that when schools are reporting the amounts of money that they're spending on revenue sharing, they have to share it with the NCAA, but then they have an option to check the box on whether it goes to the CSC, and there's already multiple schools that are not checking that box. And there's outstanding requests to determine why that is. I think we can all assume why that is, but the only way to do it is absolutely to have some sort of independent commission. But to me, the cap in and of itself is illegal. It's absolutely a restraint that I don't think can be justified from a pro-competitive standpoint. And look, there's pending appeals on the House settlement as is. So, and I know on various grounds, including Title IX, which was just discussed before. So, to me, from day one, I never found, someone said before, there's some good and some bad of the House settlement. I've never found a single good part of the House settlement, particularly because the back pay isn't even being paid out while these appeals play out. What's the positive part of going forward, where you've now created this artificial cap at $20.5 million that's going up marginally year by year, when there was no restraint on athletes prior to that? So what are schools doing? The same people who bargained for it, the same people who really wanted it, they're circumventing it. So.
Okay, Nick, I'm going to give you the last word, and the last word could be that you regret having agreed to come on to this panel, but you're in a unique position, both where you play, what you play, your engagement in this conversation. What would you want your peers, your other college athletes, football players or not, to know? What do you think would be helpful for them to know as they navigate this new landscape?
Well, at the end of the day, you're playing a sport, so just be super grateful for that. And I feel like deep down everyone that's still playing has that feeling, because we're truly in such a great position to be able to, play the sport we love. But I think one of the biggest things, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, is understand what you're signing and understand the rules of the things that you're signing. And this is why, again, it's super important for there to be an approved list of people that can represent athletes, because there's a lot of clauses that are not in favor of the athletes, and most don't know when they sign it. So I think that's a massive part of going forward. And like I said, a lot of guys still, you'll see it on social media and in the news all the time, don't know what they're signing, and then they try to do something else, and that comes up as a problem. And because of this, athletes they're really getting the short end of the stick, really, of knowing what they're being a part of. And while it's great that all the athletes are getting paid, they should understand what they're signing up for. And I think that's a huge part of agreeing to those contracts.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And thank you to our panelists for a terrific discussion. And I want to thank one more time the Congresswoman. I want to thank the Congresswoman and her staff for putting on a wonderful event, really substantive, some great ideas. So thank you for today and for everything else you do to try to help college sports. Thank you. And beyond college sports.
Well, what I just said to Nick was what I said to my colleagues most often while SCORE was, being debated, and is that there was plenty of money being spent from, the commissioners and from the NCAA, and all I wanted was for, the debate to be centered around athletes. Nick is too busy, nor does he have the resources to come to Capitol Hill and talk just in plain detail around how confusing it is, how, of course, we need a federal framework because, a state patchwork of laws does not exist, and it's confusing, and that's exactly what we're missing. So first, I just want to thank all of you. This was just supposed to be part of a reset to the conversation. I think we acknowledge the fact that there is a lack of consensus on a whole host of issues, and I think today's panels really pointed out where some of that tension exists. But making it discussable is really important for us to arrive in the right place for those of us who truly care about the future of college sports. And, it's okay that we don't have it all figured out. The House decision is only a year old. And so we have to acknowledge certain things, that we don't have all the answers today, but that we're really committed to doing the right thing. And I think in that vein, there's no single lever that Congress can pull to fix college athletics overnight, but we do know that we have to have this centered around athletes, the people who are really driving the revenue and really the value for us, culturally as a society, certainly economically. So I want to thank all of you for coming and spending your day here. From our vantage point, this is just the start of a conversation. We're going to continue engaging with stakeholders and people who care about the future of college sports, and we hope that you do too. Thank you so much. And you know what? Sometimes it's hard to believe I'm a former staffer. But I guess I was a former staffer who never got thanked that much. This doesn't happen without an incredible team. I know I can. All right, I saw Kelsey. You all, if you are in this room, you have probably met Francis and Dylan. They're incredible resources. If you have questions, if you want to register, your feedback or your ideas, your opinions on college sports, we're very open to hearing those. We don't pretend to know it all. And then I've got a whole bunch of other support people on my team here to make this particular summit go off without a hitch. And I see Kelsey Gold. I think Louisa was out front at the registration table. So, look, we don't do this work alone. So thank you so much to my team for pulling off what is hopefully an annual, but our first annual summit. Thank you.